Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku rose from the shadows part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, Prttygoodnoob Wattpad. So let's start the video. Izuku was once an excited and happy kid. He'd run around with stars in his eyes and giving a smile that could kill the sun. He was bright, kind, sweet, caring, and practically an angel. It was impossible to hate him. Izuku was loved by his family of Toshinori Yagi, Inko Yagi, and his twin sister Izumi Yagi. He was happy, life was great. Quirkless, that one word. That one measly word that was represented by an extra toe joint. Turned his happy life into one of torture. The day he had got home, their parents had celebrated the fact that their daughter had a powerful telekinesis quirk. Stronger than her own mother's. Izuku was saddened that they never even spared him a glance, but being the naive and hopeful child he was, he shook it off and headed for bed. Hoping to be comforted and for everything to become normal again. It wasn't. Izuku didn't understand. His sister and his friends apparently stopped liking him. Seeing that his dream to be a quirkless hero had personally offended them. Izuku didn't get it, but he was too pure. So he hid his scars that his sibling and friends gave them from his parents. He had done this for a month before realizing that they didn't care. Izuku's family had planned to go to a water park. Izuku was so excited to go, but when he realized that they were gone with him still at the door, the harsh reality set in. They forget him. They didn't love him. His own family hated him. All because he was quirkless. For the next 9 years, Izuku was belittled and tormented. Izumi constantly threw him around and hit him with objects. Katsuki got into his face and burned his body with explosions and made him choke on ash. Katsumi used her missile quirk at a range to knock him around and hit him when he hoped he was safe. Shoto both burned and froze him, giving him major frostbite, and 𝗧𝗏𝗄 burned him with her steam quirk. Izuku was often called Deku. Basically no one knew his real name. Because Izumi had blonde hair instead of Izuku's forest green, people never knew they were related. They bullied him for 9 years. No, bullied is to tame for what they did. They tortured Izuku for 9 years. Name-calling and beatings, every single day. It was so bad that he has started to get white hair from becoming super stressed and anxious. That only ever happens when people get tortured for an absurd amount of time. The worst part, he believed he deserved it. None of this would have happened if he got a quirk, if he had not been that unlucky 20%, although it's more like 2%. People wouldn't have to deal with a quirkless loser like him. But that doesn't mean he didn't like it, or at least longed for a single person to not look at his quirkless status and immediately think useless or waste of space. Just once. Izuku was alone for 9 years. Nobody noticed when he stopped smiling. Nobody noticed that the life left his eyes. No one noticed because no one cared. Yet miraculously he still wanted to be just like All Might. Unless something happened. Izuku sat in his middle school classroom. Last day of school, he knows he'll get a special beating for it, but Izuku doesn't care. He gets the entire holidays to hide, and so he doesn't get killed. Izuku taught himself first aid. He isn't perfect, but for learning it and 7 with no one to help him, he's pretty good. The teacher stood at the front of the room. The man held a bunch of papers in his hands. He then slowly scanned around the room. His eyes then stopped on Izuku. Izuku gulped as the teacher looked away. Every time the teacher looked at him like that, he had a plan to cause him to get beaten. Today would be no different. Alright, I'm supposed to hand out these career pamphlets, but you all want to become heroes anyway. The teacher shouted happily. The class cheered and roared in excitement, some of them demonstrating their quirk. Izuku sighed and slumped into his seat. Katsuki then decided to jump onto his desk. Yeah, like you extras have a chance of becoming heroes. Me and my squad are the only ones here with capabilities to make it big, Katsuki announced, popping out a few explosions. You guys would be lucky to be sidekicks to some D-lister, Katsumi added with a smirk. Izuku looked away, hoping to be ignored in this situation. The class didn't seem happy at the insults. Yeah, you Katsuki and Katsumi as well as the Todoroki twins and Yagi twins are wishing to go to UA, the teacher says in a tired tone. But Izuku could see past it. He could see the amusement in his teacher's eyes as they made eye contact. Izuku stiffens and averts his gaze. He is trying to instigate Izuku to be beaten. The class erupted into whispered, a lot of them being the Big Five going to UA, and how if anyone could get past the 2% acceptance rate, it was them. But the group of 5 weren't focused on that. They were focused on Izuku. The teacher had said the Yagi twins, not Izumi. Izuku forced himself not to shake. He wasn't going to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him scared. He was used to it. Izuku heard the stomping of footsteps approaching his desk, but he chose to ignore it. Or feign ignorance to something that he knew was going to hurt him. He does every day. Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku gasped at the roughness of how hard Katsuki had pulled at the collar of his shirt. He was raised out of his seat, now looking Katsuki dead in the eyes. Izuku had his eyes widened for a brief second before shrinking down. He prepared himself for an explosion. What kind of stupid are you, Deku? Do you still really think you can be a bloody hero? UA won't even accept a quirkless loser like you. Katsuki shouted. Izuku whimpered as he felt the skin of his neck start to burn from Katsuki's quirk. He could hear the class laughing at his misery. He just wanted to be loved and appreciated, even if it was by one person. Izuku challenged himself to look into Katsuki's eyes. They got rid of that rule 𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗏. I could be the first quirkless hero, Izuku stuttered trying to defend himself. Katsuki sneered, and Izuku whimpered as Katsuki's palm grew hotter. So you think you can compete with those you have quirks? Stop living in your fantasy dream and just give up, he snarked. There are those words again. They are spoken at least once every beating he has with his ex-friends and sister. Just give up. Why do they care if he doesn't succeed? If they think he'll fail, then why are they trying so hard to make him stop trying? If he fails, then they were right. If he succeeds, he proves them wrong. Izuku doesn't get it. He wants to understand, but he can't wrap his head around any situation where it would make sense. Even in the wild scenario that they actually care for him, which Izuku has realized they don't a long time ago, it still doesn't make sense. Katsuki, I still have to finish class. Please restrain yourself until the bell, his teacher says in a tired voice. Katsuki scoffs before letting go of Izuku. Izuku gasps and holds his collar where Katsuki had held him. He sighed that it was burned again. He'd have to sew it up again. Class continued for another 20 minutes, but Izuku was drowning in anxiety. His senses has heightened and his danger sense he has learned to trust. He finds it being right more than it being wrong, but he also doesn't know if he is always wrong in those situations. But right now, he can definitely feel 5 pairs of eyes glaring at him. Why is he hated so much? Why do they insist of making his life miserable if they hate him so much? The bell rings and Izuku swallows a lump in his throat. Starts putting his items in his bag as quickly as possible to keep them safe. But his sister didn't seem to like that idea. A book flings out of his bag with the use of telekinesis. Izuku's eyes widen and he can feel his heart stop beating as his future hero analyses journal is torn out of his bag and flung into the air. Izuku looks up, terrified. He watched the rest of his class quickly walk out as Katsuki basically pushes them all out of the room. He sees Izumi standing up, an evil grin on her face. His book, levitating off of the ground a few centimeters from her. Izuku looked her dead in the eyes with a pleading look, silently begging for her to stop. She saw this and her grin faltered. A flash of something crossed her face that Izuku didn't recognize. 𝗵𝗃𝗃, Izuku stuttered. But he then turned over to Shoto. He walked over to his book and grabbed it with his right hand. Izuku's eyes widened in horror as his book, something he holds dear to him, was slowly being frozen. It took about 2 seconds before his book was completely encased in ice. Izuku didn't know what to say, but in his moment of shock and horror, he didn't notice Katsumi had walked up to the book as well. He only noticed it when he saw her fingers wrapped around the floating ice crystal. She then rose the book in the air before throwing it on the ground. The book shattered into millions of tiny pieces. Izuku's eyes widened at this. His mouth hung agape and tears dropped from his face. Izuku dropped to the floor and crawled to the shattered remains of his book. Tears leaked from his face with no signs of stopping. He couldn't form any words in his head to speak as he was too lost and too broken to even say anything. Izuku then yelled. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 had fired her steam quirk at him, pushing him back into a wall. Izuku suppressed a yell. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 had manipulated her steam to be hot, causing some minor burns on his skin. Not like he hasn't had any before. Izuku started panting, tears leaked out of his face as he forced himself up. He was coughing and wheezing and his skin had become an agitated red from 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏. Izuku distantly hears the stomping of footsteps approaching him, but it's too murky for him to tell. His head is spinning and he feels broken. His hard work had literally shattered in front of him. All of his time and effort, destroyed in a second. Izuku hisses as he feels a hand on his shoulder before wincing at the intense burning feeling it was giving him. Izuku looked up and saw Katsuki Bakugo. He had a smirk on his face as he stared down at Izuku. Smoke rises from his shoulder, but Izuku is used to the sensation, too used to it. If you know what's good for you, Deku, you won't even attempt the UA entrance exam. Katsuki smiles threateningly. Izuku coughs and sobs a bit, his eyes focused on his broken book. Katsuki then stands up and walks back to his group of tormentors. Izuku was crying but slowly gets up from the floor. He sadly trots over to his bag and zips it up, not bothering to clean the mess the other 5 made. "Hey Deku," his sister said. Izuku slowly looks up at her, his hair covering most of his eyes as he stares blankly at her. She was smirking at him from the doorway, her friends all standing behind him. "If you really want a quirk that badly, I may have an idea for you," she says. Izuku doesn't show any change of emotion. She's done this before several times, saying things to try and get his hopes up only to crush them again. It has lost all effect on Izuku. "Take a swan dive from the roof and pray for a quirk in your next life," she hollers. Izuku's eyes widened in shock. The 4 behind her bellow in laughter. Izumi had, his sister had. Suicide baited him. Izuku could feel hot tears welling up again. He felt anger, but didn't know how to let it out. The world's been nothing but an arse to him despite his kindness he's given. He walked over to the doorway and squeezed past them. "If you hate me that much, then you can kill me yourself. No one would care." Izuku sniffles as he walks down the hall quite fast. The group of bullies didn't move from their spot, stunned by Izuku. Izuku didn't care or notice, but his mind was able to tell him when they couldn't see him. He sprinted and sobbed. Izuku just wanted to be loved. Izumi, Katsuki, Katsumi, Shoto and 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 were all stunned still. The words of the boy made them stop and think. Izumi covered her mouth with her hand. Why had she said that? Why did she suicide bait her own brother? Despite how she acts, she really cares for him. She's just worried that if he became a hero, he'd die on the field because of his lack of quirk. She had to admit to herself, she knew the plan was stupid. By the time it was middle school, she had understood that, but she and her friends had gone too far with this stupid plan to back out now. But now Izumi had taken it too far, and the words she had just said, she couldn't take back. "I think we have gone too far," 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 says softly, her shy attitude making her look down. I told him to kill himself," Izumi said, small tears spilled from her eyes. "I think we need to stop. Maybe we can talk to him about becoming a support hero or joining the support course at UA. I doubt what we've been doing is healthy for his mental health." "I forgot why we were doing this in the first place," Shoto says solemnly. Katsuki swore, turning away from the group. "How are we supposed to expect forgiveness from him?" Katsumi says. Izumi shook her head. "He should be upset and angry. We deserve it. What we don't deserve is forgiveness. But knowing Izuku, he'll give it to us. Whether instantly or after a while. Whatever his decision will be, we'll respect it as he at least deserves that," Izumi says. The others nod their head in agreement. Izumi then smiles brightly, thinking positively. She'll make it up to her brother, she'll be the sister he deserves, she thinks with a bright smile. Izuku walked home, taking the long way to make the trip as long as possible. He doesn't want to see Izumi nor his parents. Not like they'd care anyway. They haven't even spared him not so much as a glance the past 9 years. He would call it neglect, but the parents have to know they have a son to neglect them. Izuku has straight up been forgotten. Izuku sniffled as he kicked a rock while he walked. He was so done with everything. Maybe he should just take Izumi's advice. It'll save him future years of torment, and it's not like anyone would care. He's looked up quirkless statistics, and after looking, it isn't good. Izuku then halted. He felt his hairs on his neck stick up. He was about to be attacked, he could feel it. Izuku spun around, trying to focus on who would attack him. Izuku was terrified if that person or people were any one of his tormentors. He can handle the other assholes at school and run away with no issue. But if it was Izumi, Katsuki, Katsumi, Shoto and Ẓayato, he'd be killed the next day for defying them. He then heard something. It was a sloshing noise and it was wet. Really wet. Izuku was confused. He was underneath a bridge with a small lake next to it. But the sloshing noise wasn't coming from there. It sounded like it was below him. Izuku's eyes widened as he saw the manhole cover. He knew none of his bullies were in there and no sane person would willing go down into a sewer. So the only person in there was a villain. "What a wonderful meat suit," a voice spoke. Izuku's eyes widened and jumped back. The manhole cover shot up from the floor. It slammed into the top of the bridge. Out from the sewer was something that couldn't even be described as a man. They were slimy and a disgusting green. They had large eyes with murderous red pupils and stone-like teeth. They seemed to be the only physical aspect about the villain. Izuku's eyes looked at the villain, scared. The villain laughed as it inched closer. "Sorry kid, I need a body to use for the time being to escape from All Might. You'd be my perfect getaway," the villain said, stretching out. Izuku wasn't sure what he was doing. He was looking straight at the eyes, thinking how he could hit them before diving into the water, as the villain likely couldn't swim, as his body would dilute if they went into large amount of liquid. But for some reason he spoke. "I can do you one better," Izuku blurted out in a panic. The villain paused, looking at Izuku incredulously. Izuku was confused on what he was doing, but he couldn't back out now. "Your quirk is mutant, right? You can't turn it off. You were probably ostracized and isolated because of it, right?" Izuku says, calming down ever so slightly. The villain growls and narrows his eyes at the boy. "Why would you care?" the villain asked. Izuku gulped but didn't back down. "Because I want to be a hero. I get ostracized and isolated too. Beaten until my ribs turn purple and left to be a bloody pulp on the floor. I want to help the people who never got a chance to have a life. Even people like you who have turned into not so nice people. I know that you didn't have a choice and would give everything to just have a normal quirk like everyone else. So I want to at least try and help you, even if it is wrong by the law. It would be the right thing to do," Izuku states. The villain looks at him, wide-eyed and shocked by what the kid just said. No one had ever seen him as a human being. Just some gunk that was thrown away as soon as his quirk manifested. This kid, this absolute stranger, was treating him like a person. If the villain could cry, he'd be bawling right now. The sludge villain was about to speak, but was interrupted by a loud crash. Izuku turned around and his eyes widened at what he saw. All Might stood at the other end of the bridge. All Might was chasing after a villain. They were quite a dangerous one. They were made completely of sludge and is known for inhabiting the bodies of others and killing them. They have slipped through the cracks of others. But now he will stop this villain. All Might was given a tip that the villain would be heading through the sewer. So his first step would be to find a manhole cover. He jumped down to a stone bridge, hoping to find an entrance to the sewer. But instead he found the villain, squaring off against Izuku, his son. All Might immediately sprung into action. "Never fear, why? Because I am here," All Might shouted. All Might had arrived and yelled his catchphrase. Izuku immediately panicked and put his hands out in front of him. "All Might, wait!" Izuku shouted, but it fell of deaf ears. All Might zoomed past him and punched the sludge villain. The body of the villain instantly dispersed. Izuku watched in horror as the man's body now covered the bridge. He remained frozen in shock. All Might didn't notice this, instead picking up the remains of the villain and stuffing them into a Coca bottle. He then looked back to Izuku, who was frozen with wide-open eyes. All Might distantly remembers his son being a huge fan of his. Deciding to do him a favor, All Might grabbed out a piece of paper and signed it. He walked over to Izuku only to find him stunned. All Might frowned but quickly smiled again. He then started waving his hand in front of his face. Izuku was speechless. He watched All Might basically massacre the villain without a second thought. Wasn't he supposed to save them or try and talk to them first? Isn't that protocol for a hero? To try and talk the villain out of it before attempting to attack them. Perhaps he was missing parts of the story. Yeah, there's no way All Might would hurt someone without a second thought. Hello, hello. All Might called, now slapping Izuku's face. Izuku blinked out of his trance, staring right up at All Might. Izuku then got stars in his eyes as he looked at his idol. All Might. Izuku stuttered, flashing the hero a bright smile. The hero brightens and hands Izuku a folded-up piece of paper. Thank you, young man, in helping me apprehend this villain. In my gratitude, I give you this, All Might said. Izuku took the folded-up piece of paper curiously. He opened and immediately brightened. He got All Might's autograph. Izuku smiled genuinely, for probably the first time in years. No problem. Always happy to help a fan. Now excuse me as I give this villain into the police. All Might shouted. He got down, ready to jump, but Izuku wanted to ask him a question. A question that he's been asking since he was 4 years old. Wait, All Might. Izuku yelled. All Might paused. He turned around and looked at the boy, confused. Izuku was shaking. He had held onto his dream of being a hero for so long. Endured all of the pain and suffering that came with it just so he can help people. All Might's been his idol since he can remember. The smile on the man's face on his debut video will be embedded into Izuku's heart forever. Izuku wants to know if someone without a quirk can become a hero. He knows it's outlandish. Everyone has told him so. Yet he desperately needs just one person to say, I believe in you. It would make his world if that one person was All Might. But what if All Might said no? That aspect alone would be enough to break Izuku. The one man that kept him going despite what everyone else was doing to him. How would Izuku be able to bear it? He doesn't know himself. He tightened his body and clenched his fist, squeezing his eyes shut. He forced his mouth to ask the question that he's wanted to ask All Might his entire life. See, can someone without a quirk become a hero? Izuku asks hopefully. He doesn't move, keeping his body tight, barely shaking. When the hero doesn't answer instantly, a form of dread washes over him. He can't breathe, he feels tears start to poke his eyes. No, All Might said family. Izuku cracks a sob but doesn't move. It would be stupid for someone without a quirk to try and become a hero. It's good to have dreams, kid, but you have to be realistic. A doctor or an officer is a fine job if you want to help others, All Might says. Izuku doesn't look at him or say anything. He doesn't move and just stands there, slowly dying. Now I really must go. Get home safe. All Might yells. He stands up and turns around. All Might squats before taking off. The gust of wind pushes Izuku to the ground, but he doesn't try to get up. He remains there, crying. I'm sorry, son, but it is far too dangerous, Toshinori thought as he jumped away. Eventually Izuku had found the strength to walk home. If he could even call it home. If anything, it's where he resides, as has nowhere else to go. Izuku was void of emotion, trying to quell the feelings of the day he had just experienced. Izuku walked up to the door and tried to open it, but found it locked. Izuku sighed. He was never lucky. His parents had never bothered to give him a key, so if Izuku wants to get in, he has to hope they forget to lock the door. But this shitty day won't give him a break. It started off so well too, getting to see a pro-hero fight and the debut of Mount Lady. But just like every other time in his life, it all comes crashing down. Izuku sighed and walked around the house. This has happened plenty of times before. He leaves his window unlocked so he can climb through it. He sighed and grabbed onto a pipe next to the side of the building. Izuku was about to pull himself up, but his father's voice caught his attention. Izumi, I've got something really important to tell you, Toshinori said. Izuku was tempted to ignore it and just climb up to his room and cry, but what does he have to lose? Everyone hates or just ignores him. He has no chance at his dream or any other job if the statistics he's researched correct. What's the harm of it? No one will care anyway. Izuku reasoned. He leant over and looked through the window. Toshinori, his father, and Izumi were standing in the dining room. All right, Dad, Izumi responded. Okay, Izumi. What I'm about to tell you is not to leave this house. This is a dangerous secret that you can't tell anyone about, Toshinori says seriously. Izuku becomes intrigued by this. Also a little heartbroken that Toshinori isn't even thought about telling him this, but Izuku would expect that. He watched his father take a deep breath before suddenly, poof, he turned into a cloud of smoke. Izumi was confused while Izuku was heavily interested in what this was. He watched as the small smoke cloud cleared, and his breath hitched when he saw who was now standing where his father stood. Izuku was in shock, wide eyes and mouth agape. His father, the man whose muscle frame looked more like a skeleton than actual skeletons, just turned into All Might. The same person who had just extinguished the flames of his dreams an hour ago. Silent tears shot out from Izuku's eyes as he watched what was going on. Are you All Might? Izumi yelled in complete shock. All Might nodded his head. Indeed I am, however there is a second reason I asked you to see me, All Might said. Izuku was shaking as he watched the interaction. Every bit of him shattering as he watched his once idle-turned father talk with Izumi like she was his world while he had pushed Izuku away like he was nothing but a nuisance. Izuku was crying. What is it? Izumi asked with stars in her eyes. I want you to inherit my quirk. All Might stepped. Izuku stopped, everything in his body had shut down. Inherit his quirk. That has to be a joke, right? Some sick joke because they've noticed he was there. There's no way his father had a passable quirk and would have chosen to neglect his quirkless son when he could have saved him from all of the suffering. Izumi was confused on what her father meant. All Might then started to explain the story of One for All, stating how a powerful villain was born at the dawn of quirks 2 centuries ago with the power to give and take quirks. He used this power to manipulate people into his cause so he could have power. His brother was against it, but All for One didn't care, trying to persuade his younger brother to join him by forcefully giving him a quirk. What All for One didn't know was that his younger brother did indeed to have a quirk that he could pass down. So the stockpiling quirk that he was given was passed down to user, now residing in him. Izuku was silently listening, too shocked to even make a sound. Does Mum know about this? Izumi asked. Yes. Why wouldn't my partner Green Tornado know of my quirk? All Might said happily. Izumi then seemed to be jumping with joy while Izuku died a little bit more. He was neglected by parents who were supposed to protect him. Was he not worthy to be helped? Was he that useless? So, Izumi, do you accept my offer to hold my quirk? All Might asked. Izumi looked thoughtful. Why not Izuku? He's quirkless. Izumi asks. Izuku was crying. Yes, why not him? He's given it everything he has to be a hero. Does that not matter to his father? To All Might, the bloody symbol of peace. All Might shook his head. Because he doesn't have the heart like a true hero. You do, All Might smiled. Izuku gasped. He stepped back away from the window. Broken. How is Izumi more of a hero than he is? He's tried to help people while she only has hurt them. Is it only because he is quirkless? So Izumi, what do you say? All Might asks. Izuku didn't stay to listen. He walked away in a daze. He walked with wide open eyes and a broken expression away from his house. He was in complete autopilot, not sure where he was going, but he didn't care. If no one else did, why should he? Plus, Izuku finally registers his surroundings. He has somehow found his way into an alleyway. No clue how far he had gotten, but Izuku couldn't bring himself to care. He couldn't bring himself to stand anymore either. Izuku stumbled to a wall and slowly slid down, tears still streaked down his face. Once he was sitting on the ground, Izuku then curled in on himself and finally let it all out, wailing to the heavens and screaming with his lungs. He muttered 2 words over and over again. Why me? Izuku sat in the alleyway, tears still rolling down his face. He had started to think more on what his father had said. He had a passable quirk. One for All isn't his quirk, and that quirk is what made him All Might. So what was his quirk before One for All? Izuku had never thought of this much before, but what was his father's quirk? He knew his mother's quirk has a telekinesis quirk, but he was tricked into believing it was a weak one. It clearly wasn't, as it was the quirk Green Tornado had. The number 8 Pro Hero. But what was his father's quirk? Izuku thinks hard and has come to the conclusion that he's never said his quirk. But if he was given one for all, he'd still have his original quirk, wouldn't he? Unless he was. Izuku stopped. If his father was quirkless, it would only make sense of how he became quirkless. It was still an incredibly rare chance for him to become quirkless, but it was a lot higher than if he did have a quirk. Izuku couldn't believe it. His father, who he is probably quirkless, neglected his quirkless son, something that he once experienced. Izuku started to cry again. "Hey, a crybaby is out late at night," a voice said. Izuku sniffled and looked up. 2 men approached him. The man who spoke first seemed to have sickly pale skin. But on closer inspection, Izuku identified that his skin was a light gray. He had dark hair and eyes that were impossible to see the color of them in the dark. He wasn't tall but was well built. The second guy was taller than the other man. He was lanky and tall. He had black hair that seemed to have random yellow highlights in his hair. Izuku gulped as tried backing away, only to remember that he was already backed against a wall. Izuku tried to talk, but the gray-skinned male dashed forward. Izuku yelled, but it was quickly silenced by the man's hand. Izuku was panicking. These men were going to hurt him. "It's your own fault, kid. A string bean like you shouldn't be out this late at night," the lanky male said. "Just be quiet and do your job as a lookout," the other man barked. The lanky man rolled his eyes before turning around. Izuku was panicking. He tried to push the man off of him, but it was no use. He was clearly a lot stronger than Izuku. Izuku then felt something sharp start poking his face. Izuku looked down and saw the man's fingernails were causing his face to bleed. They were silver, but also looked shiny, like it was something metallic. "What the F? Do you not have anything? Not even a phone?" the man stated angrily. Izuku looked up at him pleadingly, hoping to at least be able to say something, but all he got was a punch to the stomach. Izuku choked at the force. It was a lot harder than what any of his bullies had given him before. Even stronger than Toyoshi with a rock mutation quirk and Shoto when he covers his fist in ice. It was like this man's fist was harder than the regular person. But it didn't make sense. His quirk gives him metal fingernails. The man punched him again, and it felt a lot worse the first time. He had probably bruised him from the first punch. The man smirked as he saw Izuku's expression, deciding to readjust his grip. He covered Izuku's face entirely with his hand before lifting him up with that one arm. Izuku then felt his head starting to break. This guy was strong. He obviously had more than a quirk that made his nails metal. But what could he do? What could a useless Deku like him do? Grab him? Something inside Izuku's was telling him to grab the man. An instinct was more correct. Izuku, in a blind panic and fear, Izuku reached his hand forward. He grabbed the man's face with his hand. Izuku didn't know why he was doing it, but he wasn't expecting any results from it. Izuku wasn't aware of anything. The only thing he could feel was pain. But the next thing he knew, Izuku was dropped. Izuku started coughing and held his face with his hand. He wasn't sure on what just happened, but he looked up to the man who had just held him. He was on the ground, groaning, seeming like he was in pain. What happened? Izuku thought. The man shook his head, then looked up at him angrily. "What the F was that?" the man yelled angrily. Izuku was scared, but he knew he couldn't just let the man attack him again. Quickly, Izuku lunged forward and slammed his fist down onto the man's face. The man yelled and quickly slammed into the back of his head into the pavement, knocking him out. Izuku was shocked. He didn't think he had enough strength to do that. "Oh, another voice said. Izuku looked up to see the other man running up to him. Izuku had completely forgotten he was there. Izuku's eyes widened as electricity started to emit around his body. Izuku jumped back as the man quickly approached him. Izuku looked around the alleyway, trying to look for something. It seemed as though the man couldn't fire his electricity outwards, otherwise he would have already done it. His attacker charged at Izuku head-on, meaning he had to get close. Izuku saw a garbage can and quickly picked it up. He seemed to pick it up easier than he had expected, but that could be the adrenaline helping him out with it. He threw it at the rushing villain and it slammed him on the head. Izuku didn't waste his opportunity and attacked the man. Running at him, Izuku got down low and swept the man's leg with his own like he's seen several pro heroes do. The man yelped and quickly fell down. The man must have been heavily off balance as the man barely put up any resistance as he dropped to the ground. But the man wasn't out. He looked up at Izuku angrily and reached out his hand. Izuku yelled as Izuku felt like he was being tasered. Izuku could feel the stinging sensation from his stomach flow through his entire body, particularly his bones as he crumpled. He felt the similar instinct to what he felt before. In his delirious haze of being shocked, Izuku reached for the villain and gripped him tight. Suddenly the pain of being electrocuted stopped. Izuku cracked his eyes open to the sound of the man yelling. Izuku looked down and looked at the man's face. His eyes had rolled to the back of his head and he was twitching violently. Izuku quickly stood back up and jumped away in fright. What had happened? What did he just do? The villain stopped twitching shortly after Izuku removed his hand. His eyelids closed shut and he became limp. Izuku stared at the man in shock. He quivered against the wall as his eyes were glued to the figure laying there on the ground. Izuku stared at him intently, trying to find any sort of movement or breathing or any sense of life. Had he killed him? Izuku dropped down to sit, his legs giving out. Izuku couldn't stop shaking as his eyes refused to leave the man's body. Izuku slowly started to breathe quicker. His breath was becoming irregular and too quick to determine if he had just inhaled or exhaled. What had he done? Izuku's hands snaked their way to his hair and started to pull it. He kept shaking his head, staring down at the body. Then a flash of yellow light caught Izuku's attention. Finally pulling his eyes away from the possible dead man, Izuku looked up his arms. They were crackling electricity. Izuku stopped. He slowly removed his hands from his hair and looked at them. Izuku stared at the electricity. It was that man's quirk. How did he get it? He was quirkless and he definitely would know if he had a copy quirk. But no copy quirk ever actually hurt the target who had their quirk copied. If anything, it would hurt the user having an unnatural ability now in their body, even if it was for a short amount of time. Izuku then caught a quick shine on the tips of his fingers. He turned his fingers down and looked at what caught his eyes. Izuku saw that his fingertips were no longer a light pink but a shiny silver. A metallic silver. Izuku then looked over to the other guy who also laid limp on the ground. Izuku could see his fingertips and saw that they were regular. Izuku's eyes widened. He had two quirks at once. Even that was unheard of for a copy quirk. Not having two stored quirks, two active quirks at once. Izuku gulped and tried to calm himself down. He had to make sure that they were alive. He wouldn't know what to do if they were dead. Izuku didn't want to be a murderer. He didn't even know what just happened, he just panicked. Izuku took deep breaths, remembering those videos to help with panic attacks. They did really help, because he had to psych himself up every morning to leave his room. During the breathing, Izuku had closed his eyes. Once he opened his eyes, the electricity was gone. Izuku sighed as he shakily looked at his arms. He then frowned once he got back to his fingernails. They were still metal. Shaking it off, Izuku then crawled over to the guy with yellow highlights in his hair. Izuku then starts to wonder if those are natural or dyed. Quirks do tend to change the user's appearance even if the quirk itself isn't a mutant type. Rather an emitter or transformation. Like the guy from before, his quirk made his skin gray despite him most likely having a dash. No bad, Izuku. Stop geeking about quirks in a time like this, find out if these two are alive. Izuku breathed out a shaky breath and slowly moved his arm over to the man who had an electric quirk. Izuku gasped out a sigh of relief. He still had a pulse. Izuku became content at the revelation that he hadn't killed a man. Izuku then crawled over to the man with a metal nail quirk. Izuku chuckled softly that he was alive. But now, what was he going to do? Izuku should really call the police to get these two to jail. But then he'd have to tell the operator on the other line who he was. Not that him saying his name was a problem, but that his parents would be contacted. They were probably on bed or celebrating with Izumi that she was receiving that stupid quirk from Dad. If they were interrupted with whatever they were doing to come and get him, they would be extremely annoyed and furious. Although his parents had never hurt him physically, it may be because they never knew he was there in the first place. If they suddenly remember he existed, he wouldn't be surprised if he got a good slap to the face. Oh, and Izumi would definitely beat him. She had never done it at home, but it's because she probably doesn't want to break anything or was too distracted by her parents to notice Izuku as well. Izuku sighed and lowered his head. He finally had a quirk that could at least copy others. He would no longer be a quirkless Deku and might be able to have a normal life and go to UA with the rest of them. But did he really want that, even after everything they put him through? Would that even happen? Izuku sighed and stood up. He looked straight forward from where he was and saw a window. The window was dark and Izuku couldn't see anything through it. The sky may not have been much brighter, but Izuku could still see. The window still had his reflection there. Izuku walked forward to it, wincing at the view. He had several cuts and bruises all over his face and even a burn on the side of his neck from Katsumi. His hair was long and untamed. He had only had a haircut twice in the past 9 years, and that was Izuku grabbing the kitchen scissors and cutting his own hair because his hair was too long and kept getting in his eyes and mouth. He had tried to straighten it out, but his hair refused to cooperate. He wished he got his father's genes for this part, as his mother's curly hair kept getting tangled and grew out like an afro. Izuku had accepted a long time ago that his hair would be messy and untamed forever. Unless he was going to cut it off completely, but if Izuku was completely honest, he kind of liked it. Izuku raised his hand and brushed the gray hairs near his ears he had been growing. He first started to notice them a year ago, but he's slowly been getting more. Izuku didn't want to be called an old man before he graduated high school. Izuku sighed disappointedly as he looked at himself. Other than the wild nature of his hair, he didn't really like what he saw. His beady green eyes and tiny freckles. His small and frail stature that was heavily malnourished. The dark bags underneath his eyes and the bright green hair that reminded him of his mother. He didn't like it. Izuku attempted a smile. He can't remember the last time he smiled. He used to give fake smiles all the time, but he stopped bothering after he came to terms that no one cared about if he was okay or not. Even if he wanted to ruin his old friends' and sisters' chances to get into UA, not like anyone would believe him. He gave a shaky smile that wasn't even a smile. His mouth was more like a round rectangle than the edges of his lips going up and his eyes slightly narrowing. His eyes just squinted as he scanned his face. God, he really didn't like how he looked. He hated the places that obviously looked like his mother, as he didn't really have much physical features from his father other than being skinny. But then something caught Izuku's eye. His teeth seemed dark. Izuku inched closer to the window. He hooked his lip with his index finger and lifted it up to get a better look. Izuku tilted his head up and moved his head around. Izuku was trying to notice what was wrong with them, because they were certainly not white or yellow. Could they be rotting? No, they would hurt if they were rotting. Izuku used his other hand and pointed out his index finger. He then started tapping on his teeth. They certainly weren't normal. They were hard, but not like regular teeth. They were also strangely cold despite his mouth being warm. Izuku kept tapping them but then yelped in pain. He had hit his teeth with his metal fingernail. There was a clang sound like metal had hit each other. Izuku's eyes widened in realization. He opened his mouth again and looked at his teeth. They were metal. Wait, how was that man's teeth and nails both metal? That doesn't make sense. Although quirks are unpredictable, they still have some sense in logic with them that works with real-world examples. Like the user manipulates the temperature of the water molecules in the air and expands them to create ice. Or how electric quirks are still attracted to metal and can charge batteries and other things. It doesn't make sense if the user has specifically their nails and teeth metal. Unless they weren't the only thing metal. Despite their appearance, both teeth and nails are in fact bones. So it would make sense if the user had metal bones. The man did have a hard punch. Izuku couldn't really test that out if he had metal bones, but it would make sense. Now that the Izuku's adrenaline had run out, his body did feel oddly heavy. It took a considerable amount of effort to just raise his arm. It could just be the exhaustion or the pain Izuku was feeling, but how the man was punching him before. It felt like there was something else in his hand. If his bones were metal, that would make sense. Izuku huffed and looked at his nails and tried to concentrate in turning his quirk off to test his theory. The only problem was that it wasn't turning off. Izuku was slowly starting to get frustrated and panic. Why wasn't the quirk turning off? The other man's electric quirk did, so why wasn't his? There are a few emitter quirks that actually can't be turned off, but there are no examples as such for a transformation quirk. The only other way a quirk can't be turned off is if it was a mutant quirk. But Izuku wouldn't be able to copy it then. There are no cases of a copy quirk that can copy a mutant quirk. Not that they are very common, they are one of the rarest types of quirks. Even Eraserhead's erasure quirk didn't affect mutant quirks. So why did his? It would be strange if his quirk could copy mutant quirks while others couldn't, especially since his mother had a telekinesis quirk and his father, well, might be quirkless. But what if he didn't copy the person's quirk? Izuku remembers seeing the man with metal nails no longer had them. If his quirk was a mutant quirk, then he should still have them if Izuku copied his quirk. But what if he hadn't copied the thug's quirk? What if he had taken it? Izuku had scanned through quirks that could possibly transfer a quirk, but those are only theories. Implausible theories. How, although theoretically possible by quirk law, it seems outrageous that a quirk could possibly be given or taken from someone else. But if Izuku had truly stolen the man's quirk, he surely could give it back. So with shaky hands and a weird sense of curiosity and determination, Izuku slowly stepped over to the man. He put his hand on the head and tried to channel his quirk. Not like he knew how, especially since he has never had a quirk to use before. Well, until no, but it was more of a panic response. Izuku closed his eyes and tried to focus. He felt two things. One seemed to be heavy and earthy and yet natural, while the other felt sharp, energetic, and stung. The earthy one seemed to have a connection to the man Izuku was touching, so Izuku channeled it. Izuku then felt that earthy and heavy feeling leave his body. Opening his eyes, Izuku grabbed the man's hand and was shocked to see that his nails were metal once more while his were regular again. Izuku's eyes brightened at the prospect that he did make people quirkless without the ability to return their power. Izuku turned around and went to give the other man his quirk back. But stopped. These people tried to hurt him. They were villains. It's not like they were forced into this type of life. Their quirks were definitely not seen by weak or villainous by society's standards. The man with the gray skin also seemed to take joy in hurting him even when discovering he didn't have anything of value. Do these men really deserve their quirk? Izuku had been quirkless all his life. Well, supposedly quirkless. He had been repressed and hurt by virtually everyone. There had only been 3 people in Izuku's life that hadn't treated him like trash or a fragile bunny that couldn't do anything. That was the old woman at the end of the street who is also quirkless herself, but she was born in a time where that was a lot more common. When quirklessness was actually 20%. They haven't bothered to update those statistics in over 3 decades. The second person was a girl with a quirk that can emit a very deadly gas from her breath. There were white highlights in it that made it so the front of the gas had an image of a skull on it. Definitely deemed as a villainous quirk. The girl was from Kyoto and was only here in Musafatsu for a vacation. The girl had seen Izuku crying and went over to help him. He had told the woman not to bother because he was quirkless and a waste of her time, but she had told him that he wasn't. She had told him about her shitty life, and because of her villainous quirk, she got stuck as a construction worker instead of the veterinarian that she was working for. Unfortunately, Izuku hasn't seen her since, as she was only in Musafatsu for a vacation. The last one was Shoto's and Zyato's eldest sibling. He didn't have a weak quirk or a villainous quirk. In fact, he actually had quite a powerful quirk. Even stronger than Endeavor's, which is their father. However, he had the issue of not being immune to his own quirk. But apparently his father didn't get that and kept training him in hopes that his body would get used to his quirk. Izuku didn't know the full story, but he knew it was bad as 𝗬𝗧 committed suicide. He knows Uncle Enji was devastated about his death and blamed himself on it. Izuku couldn't really blame him, he was the cause of his death. He knows this was especially because Enji started insulting 𝗬𝗧 that Shoto and Zyato's didn't have his problem with their quirk and was constantly called a failure. Izuku really misses him. When Shoto and Zyato's along with the Bakugos and Izumi started hurting him, 𝗬𝗧 had came to his defense. He was able to stop them for a while when they first started. But he committed suicide 6 months later, just a few days after he turned 15. Izuku had bought him a birthday gift and he actually cried. Apparently he was the only one to even remember his birthday at all. Izuku felt sorry for him and wished he could have saved him. Which is why he stopped visiting Uncle Enji and Aunt Ray, who were nice to him entirely. If they treated 𝗧𝗪 like dirt, someone with a powerful quirk, how would they treat someone without a quirk at all? These two men probably had some shitty job or were bullies that never grew out of it. Troublemakers who have gotten into crime and now can't get out. Whatever their reasons were, definitely weren't justified. So Izuku bent back down and put his hand back on the man's face. He felt the familiar, natural and earthy feeling and sucked it back into his body. He then felt heavier, which had only confirmed to Izuku that he had gotten the quirk back. Izuku then looked at the two thugs. What to do now? He's already came up with a reason why he can't call the police. But he obviously can't just let them go. With quirks or not, they'd still likely terrorize other people or come after him. Izuku also didn't know if his quirk was permanent or not, but he had a strange feeling that it was. Izuku looked around the alley and saw some rope. It obviously looked worn and had been used a lot. Likely why it was thrown out. But it was surely still strong enough to tie these two men up. He walked over and grabbed it before going to the two men again. He pulled them together and wrapped the rope around them. He then went to his bag and grabbed one of his books and a pen. Izuku ripped out the page before writing a note on it. He then stuck the note on the side of the man's face before standing up. Izuku then turned around and left the alley, only to remember that he didn't actually know where he was. Cautiously Izuku looked out of the alley to find the street mostly barren. Izuku then saw a service station on the other side of the road. Izuku sighed as he realized where he was. In his start of delirium he must have subconsciously gone to his safe place. Izuku walked out of the alleyway and headed in the direction to the place he more calls home than where he properly lives. 𝗧𝗪𝗏 Beach was once an appealing tourist attraction about a decade ago. But because of the selfishness and pure negligence of the tourist and locals, the beach has become a dump. Now the only reason people will actively go to 𝗧𝗪𝗏 to dump trash that are too big to fit in their bins or if they have run out of room. But about 2 years ago, Izuku ran in the beach in hopes of getting away from his tormentors. He found a caravan that was mostly intact. Curiously, Izuku had opened the door and found the caravan was still in pretty good condition, despite it obviously being old. Izuku had actually cleaned that caravan up a bit to make it feel better and more homey than his room and had bought a sleeping bag with the little amount of money he owned to sleep there when he wanted to relax. It was his safe place, a place where none of his bullies would ever bother to come in just to beat him up. As Izuku was walking there though, his mind wandered back to his quirk. He could steal quirks and give them to others. Where has he heard that quirk before? Did he have all for one? How did he have all for one? Despite how much he hated his father, Izuku did know for a fact that Toshinori was his biological dad. So him being quirkless would make sense if his father was quirkless. But Izuku was born after Toshinori was given one for all, which would now be incorporated into his father's DNA, as that is how quirks worked. Copy and obvious all for one would be a slight exceptions to that rule, but it should still work the same. Since the original user of one for all was the brother to all for one, it would make sense how he got this quirk. Izuku grunted and shook his head. He was tired and has been a long bad day. He can think about it tomorrow. Izuku walked into the beach and walked over the mounds of trash. He walked to the caravan and opened the door. Izuku took in a breath of air as he slid down against the door. He looked down at his hands, looking at the metal nails that he now had. He activated his electricity and allowed it to run around his body. Izuku smiled, a genuine smile. It was a nice feeling, finally not being quirkless. Izuku sighed and stood up. He walked over to the sleeping bag that was resting on the small mattress. Izuku grabbed it and gave a content hum. Izuku was really glad that it was the holiday so he didn't have to face them for a while. Izuku then frowned. How would they react if they found it he had all for one? The same quirk of his father's enemy. His parents would probably want to join him in beating him as well. Did Izuku want to go home? So Izumi, what do you say? Dad asked with a smile. Izumi stared at her father in shock. Her dad was All Might and her mother was Green Tornado. She was so shocked and so happy. The fact that both of her parents were top 10 heroes did surprisingly explain a lot. But that wasn't what her mind should be thinking about. She was being offered her father's quirk. That quirk is what has made him the symbol of peace and the undisputed #1 hero. It is a dangerous secret that would be problematic if the general public found out that his quirk could be passed to others. People from all over the world would try and get their hands on it because of how powerful his quirk was. Which is what makes the holder of One for All so specific. They had to be driven to be a hero and only use the quirk for good purposes. But Izumi knows that she doesn't fit the bill. She was a bully, and that's putting it lightly. She's been in but to several kids in her school, but none of them were nearly as bad as Izuku. Herself and her friends had started the whole bullying to get him to stop trying to be a hero. He had the heart and drive, but he didn't have a quirk. It would give him the disadvantage in all fights no matter how smart he was. It was just too risky. But beating him down day after day, hurting him with their quirks, and changed his name that probably everyone outside of our class didn't actually know his real name. He's just called Deku. Izumi isn't stupid, but what she does know is that she is selfish. She loves the attention that her parents give her, all the love and time they have together. She wouldn't want it any other way. Actually, that's a lie. She would like Izuku to be part of it as well. He knows that her mother and father don't speak with Izuku and that he doesn't come down and eat with them at dinner. Also thinking about it recently, has he ever gone on a family vacation trip with them? Izumi doesn't remember the last time they actually spent time together that wasn't her hitting him. Because perhaps, there wasn't a time where Izuku had been part of the family. Not after his diagnosis as quirkless. Izumi wasn't worthy of One for All, she knew that. It was for people with golden souls who would risk their lives for others no matter who they were. A complete stranger, a General JRK, or someone weaker than them. They were the person who was a true hero. Izumi didn't deserve One for All. But Izuku did. I'm sorry, Dad, but I don't think I would be the appropriate holder for One for All, Izumi said, lowering her head. Why would you not be suited to hold One for All? I wouldn't be able to give you my quirk instantly, which is why we would train, Dad said. Izumi shook her head, looking back up at him. No, I mean there is somebody much more suited for it than me, Izumi admitted. If not you, then who? Dad asked, confused. Izumi smiled brightly and clapped her hands together. Izuku, she yelled happily. He's always as happy and really optimistic to everyone no matter how mean or dirty there are to him. If someone is getting bullied at our school, he'll get in the way to protect them without actually fighting them as it's wrong. He never has asked for anything in return, and if he is ever offered anything, he declines anyway, Izumi explained. Dad seemed to understand and smiled. I see, then he would be a good fit to inherit my quirk. We would have to train hard to help fix that skinny body he has. But when he gets home, let's tell him the good news, Dad said. Izumi brightened and looked giddy. Now her brother can become heroes with the rest of her friends together like they had planned when they were younger. It still didn't get rid of the guilt that Izumi feels, and it will definitely take a while until she is forgiven. Izumi knows that, and it's okay. But she'll make it up to her brother, and this is the start. Izumi went to the lounge room and started watching TV until Izuku got home. An hour passed and Izuku had yet to come home. She was starting to get worried. Why hadn't he come home yet? Despite how little she actually knew about her brother, she did know he didn't have any friends. Which only aided in her feeling worse. Mum walked through the door. She saw Izumi looking worried. Immediately she went over to comfort her daughter. Izumi dear, what's wrong? Mum asked. Izumi huffed and leaned down, putting her head in her hands. Izuku isn't home yet. I'm worried that something happened to him, Izumi said. Mum frowned. She reached over and patted her back. He'll be fine, dear. He always has been, her mother tried to comfort. Izumi scowled at that thought. Izuku has always lied about being fine, although he has never been fine. Always putting on a fake smile and hiding his scars. Scars that she gave him. He probably has never felt loved in years as her parents have been so focused on her. Izumi stood up and walked over to a counter with a bunch of photographs on it. Izumi looked at it sadly. There were several photos of her and her parents. There was a picture of them at an amusement park. One of them when they went on a trip to America where she met a girl called 𝗵𝘃𝗃𝗍𝗃. She was so smart and tech-savvy, she wanted to work as a support hero when she became older. But the best part was that she was also quirkless. She was loved by her father and others around her. No one cared that she was quirkless. Unlike Izuku, who gets name called daily and is constantly abused by her. She was such a shitty sister. Izuku wasn't in a single picture. He was never around and her parents never paid attention to him. Izumi wonders just how he feels right now. "Mom, why isn't Izuku in any of these photos?" she asked. She knew why. They were neglecting him. So she had to do something. If she was going to redeem herself, she had to start by showing her parents how bad they are. Her mother looked confused. She walked over at the counter to look at the photos. She was scanning them, trying to find one with Izuku, only to slowly realize he wasn't in any of them. Becoming panicked, she then grabbed a book. Izumi was only able to see the cover of it briefly but was able to determine it was their photo album. She started flipping through the book, desperately trying to find at least one picture of him. Izumi sighed and looked away. She knew she wouldn't find one. Her mother still flipped through the book before finally stopping on a page. She looked at it and started to cry. Izumi leaned over to see what she was looking at and started to cry as well. It was her and Izuku's 4th birthday. His last birthday party. He never had one after that. "We've been neglecting him," her mother sobbed, crouching down and crying louder. Her father then came back into the room. He saw her wife sobbing and Izumi crying and immediately ran up to him. "What happened? Are you two okay?" he asked frantically. Izumi's mum shook her head no. She jumped over to him and showed him the photo album. "He isn't here. We haven't done anything with Izuku since his diagnostic." Her mother cried with tears shooting down her face. Dad went pale. He had been neglecting his own son because of his quirklessness. Something that he was once himself. He knew it wasn't a nice experience and his own parents weren't exactly happy about it either. He promised himself to be a better father. How did he become so much worse? "Where is he? Has he come home yet?" Izumi's father asked. Izumi shook his head. "No, I'm worried something happened to him," Izumi said. Her father went pale. He had seen Izuku earlier in the day and saved him from the sludge villain. But he had also crushed his dreams of being a hero. He had to find him and bring him home. To make everything right. He ran to the door and opened it before quickly bulking up. "I'll be back. I'll find Izuku," her father yelled before leaping off. Izumi's mother remained crying as she went to the bathroom. Izumi looked at the door worried and walked over to it. She looked out to the sky with a frown and small tears. "Please. Be okay, Izuku. I never wanted this, I'm so sorry," she pleaded. Hours had passed, the sunset had turned to night. Izumi was worried, she felt guilty and angry at herself. Her dad couldn't find her brother. It had been 2 hours since he left and he is yet to come back. Did Izuku take Izumi's advice? She had told him to kill himself today. Don't tell her that he actually did it. Izumi shook those thoughts out of her head. She had to think positive. Besides, there is no way Izuku would do that. He was too damn stubborn and determined to give up. He had held strong for years, surely he wouldn't have let today get to him, right? Toshinori huffed defeatedly as he walked home. He had gone past his limits of 3 hours to try and find Izuku, but he had found nothing. It's like he just disappeared. Toshinori sighed as he weighed his options on what to do. He should ring him up as a missing child's case. But this would cause problems with people close to him like Naomasa, Torino, the Todorokis and Bakugos. But he most certainly can't announce that he, All Might, now has a missing child that he neglected. Not only would it ruin his reputation as the symbol of peace, but the Hero Commission would never allow it anyway. Toshinori didn't know what to do. No matter which option he chose, it would end up badly. With himself, his friends and his family. No matter which way you slice it, it's a bad outcome. But he deserves it, doesn't he? He neglected his own son who had the exact same problem as he did for 9 years. He was supposed to be the damn #1 hero. How could he call himself a hero if he couldn't even be one to his own damn son? Lowering his head in defeat, he reached into his pocket and grabbed his phone. There was only one person he could call that would make the right decision for him. Dialing the number, he put the phone to his ear to wait for his friend to speak. "Hello Toshi, what's up?" his friend asked with a happy tone. Guilt flooded Toshinori as his hand and shook. He was about to tell his friend what was wrong. He's not sure if they'll be friends after this. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, listen. I need help. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stood in the Yagi household. Toshinori, Izumi and Inko all sat on a couch with Tsukachi sitting in a chair opposite to them with a look of shock and disgust. They had expected this. He has every right to be upset with them. Neglecting Izuku for 9 years because he was quirkless, especially since Toshinori himself was quirkless. It's hard to swallow. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was stunned, silenced. He was hoping, no praying that this was all just some sick joke, but his quirk told no lies. The man that he had once thought of as a friend had neglected his own son. To make it worse, it was something as hypocritical as him being quirkless. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 remembers the day when they were birthed. He came to visit his friend for support and he had never seen him so happy. Toshinori had made a vow that no matter what, he would love his children and be a better father than what his parents had been to him. What a load of SHT that ended up being. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had forgotten that Toshinori had a son. That's how bad his neglect got. He could only think of one thing to say. "Nana would hit you so hard right now," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stated. Toshinori stiffened at his words but nodded his head. "Yes, she would." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sighed and held his head. Getting mad at him now wouldn't help the situation. It's obvious he's beating himself up enough. But right now he has to make sure that this is just a missing child case, not a runaway. Seeing as how Inko and Toshinori haven't as so much looked at their son in the past 9 years, they won't be any help. So 𝗧𝗵𝗲 turned his eyes to Izumi. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sent the girl as soft glare. Immediately she tensed and looked away. She knew something. "Izumi," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stated, getting her to look at him again. Her parents gave her a worried glance. Izumi gulped as he narrowed her eyes at her. "Izumi, seeing as you probably know him the best, I'm going to ask you a few questions," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said seriously. Izumi shakily nodded her head. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 took note of the tremor in her fingers, the terrified expression she wore and how she couldn't meet his eyes. She knew something or did something bad. Looking at the situation, probably both. Her mother reached over and held her hands. She gave her a sympathetic smile before turning back to the detective. "What was your brother like?" he asked. Izumi looked away, but smiled sadly. "He was the kindest person you'd meet. He has a love for both heroes and quirks. He even carries notebooks on them and analyses them. Both strengths and weaknesses. He had an appealing and kind heart who would put himself in front of others without question if they were getting hurt at school. He's shy and not very social but caring nonetheless," she smiled. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 raised an eyebrow at her. His quirk didn't activate, so Izumi was telling the truth, which made 𝗧𝗵𝗲 angrier that they were neglecting a kind-hearted kid like that. But even though she had said all of those things, her actions before didn't represent the same emotions she was showing now. "Izumi, would you say that you are friends with your brother?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked, narrowing his eyes at her. The girl flinched and her nervous behavior came back again. "Why, yes," she responded. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 slumped his shoulders and looked unimpressed at the girl. She glowed red, telling 𝗧𝗵𝗲 that she had lied. "Izumi, I have a lie detector quirk and I can tell that you lied. Please tell me your exact relationship with your brother," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said sternly, glaring at the girl. Toshinori and Inko gasped before turning to Izumi. She was shaking and now she looked on the verge of tears. Izumi looks down full of shame. "I bully him," she stutters, a single tear dropping onto the floor. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 scoffs quietly that they don't hear it and roll his eyes. "Can you explain why, please?" he asks, looking up at her. She coughs out a sob, her eyes turning red and puffy, and she brings her legs up to the couch. "He wants to be a hero. He always has been, and when he was diagnosed quirkless. That determination didn't change. I was scared that he would die. Hero work is dangerous, even with a quirk. Not having one is just suicide. So I'm my friends and I made a plan. If we bully him into giving up, he'd give up on being a hero. But he never did and still hasn't," Izumi sobbed. "How bad was the bullying?" 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked, narrowing his eyes at her. Izumi winces and covers her face with her hands. She stayed silent, not answering the question. Izumi, he said threateningly, I suggest you cooperate, he said, scarily serious. Izumi sniffled and nodded her head, but not removing her hands. 𝗬𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 with our quirks. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at her in anger and bewildered at what she just said. She and her friends bullied him for 9 years because he wanted to be a hero. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 has heard a lot of outrageous reasoning, whether it be from conspiracy or stupidity. But this is ludicrous. So let me get this straight. Instead of talking to him like a normal person, you and your friends decided to bully him every day for simply wanting to be a hero without a quirk. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked. His voice still sounded professional, but there was a lot of anger in it that the 3 Yagis could identify. Izumi lowered her head and nodded. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sighed and gripped the bridge of his nose. He felt like a schoolteacher trying to teach a 2nd grader how subtraction works. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looked at the girl who was still sobbing and clutching her knees to her chest. Does Izuku have any friends? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked. Izumi shook her head and cried harder. We were his only friends. But when we started bullying him, the other kids joined in. They would call him Deku like we do and often joined in to hit him. No one wanted to be friends with him in risk of us hurting them as well, she cried. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 huffed and shook his head, doing the best he can to hold his anger. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 then looked over to Tashinori, who looked destroyed. He understands, but 𝗧𝗵𝗲 wasn't about to comfort him. He deserves every feeling that he currently has. Tashinori caught 𝗧𝗵𝗲's gaze and met it. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 then gestured to Izumi and had a silent conversation with the man. Tashinori's eyes widened before looking down in shame. He nodded his head. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sighs and shakes his head disappointedly. So Toshi, please tell me why Izumi knows about One for All and why Izuku probably doesn't, despite him being a much better candidate from what I've heard. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked with a tired tone, completely over everything he's heard today. He needs a holiday after all of this is done. I only told Izumi today. I offered her my quirk, but she said Izuku was a better fit. I agreed, but he hasn't come home for me to tell him, Tashinori said sadly. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 glares at the man. If Izumi had said yes, would you have told Izuku about you being All Might? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 says angrily, his professionalism slips. Tashinori doesn't meet 𝗧𝗵𝗲's heated stare. I don't think I would have even thought about it, Tashinori admits. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sneers at this, his quirk telling him that he told the truth. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 stood up abruptly, shocking the 3 Yagis. He stares at the 3 with an unimpressed look. Before we discuss the punishment for you 3 and your friends Izumi, I would like to see Izuku's room, he said. His tone left no room for argument, not like any of them would anyway. Inko nodded her head and stood up. She led the detective down the hall before gesturing to the door. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 didn't even look at her before opening it. Immediately upon entering it, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 is overwhelmed by the smell. It was overbearing with disinfectant, bleach, and medicine. It fills the entire room. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 coughs and covers his nose with his arm. The 3 Yagis look horrified while 𝗧𝗵𝗲 enters. This room doesn't look that bad in condition, but it was probably from Izuku cleaning it. The room was incredibly barren. A dirty mattress and sheets that have BLD stains on them, with a small desk that looks like it'll break, and second with a closet that seems normal on first glance. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 growled and walked over to it. He swung the door open and scowled. Ignoring the fact that Izuku has 3 clothes hanging at the top, with one of them being a uniform that looks badly burned. At the bottom of the closet was 3 shorts, with one of them being burned. But what 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was more focused about was the bleach, disinfectant, burn cream, gauge tape, and several other medical supplies sitting next to the shorts. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 frowned as he spotted something else hidden at the back. He reached forward and grabbed it and pulled it back out. It was a pill bottle. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 scanned over the label of the bottle. They were painkillers, powerful ones as well. You can only be administered these in a hospital. The Yagis who were still at the door, too afraid to take a step in Izuku's room, gasped when they saw what 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was holding. Is that?" Inko asked shakily. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 sighed and pocketed the pill bottles. It's painkillers. Powerful painkillers. You can only get these at hospitals as you can't be prescribed these at a pharmacy. Which means that Izumi beat Izuku so badly that he had to resort to finding someone with these, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 said, now glaring at Izumi, or these were the only ones he could find. You better hope it is the latter, he said menacingly. Izumi gulped and looked away. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 closed the closet door. He then spotted something tucked away to the side of it. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 raised an eyebrow and leaned over to see what it was. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 paled. Slowly he bent down and grabbed the item. He looked back at the family with rage as he showed them what he was holding. He was holding a small office rubbish bin. The contents in it smelled vile as they were bloody bandages. A lot of them. They were almost all a deep crimson, and the worst part is that they don't look that old. It's highly likely that there has been several more bloody bandages. The Yagis all become deeply disturbed and horrified at what they were looking at. The amount of BLD here can equal a normal murder scene. By the looks of it, they look recent, so there have been loads of these bloody bandages. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 yelled angrily. The Yagis all jumped back by his voice. He looked furious. Izumi, what are the names of your friends now? I want you to call them and bring them over here, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 demanded. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃, she stammered, absolutely terrified. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 then looked up to her parents. Great, you call them over. I'll call Nizu and have him deal with you, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 said angrily. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 then stormed off and grabbing his phone. He dialed the sadistic rat. Probably the first time in his life was he actually happy to see Nizu. He was about to press the green call button when Toshinori suddenly spoke. Wait, what are we going to do about Izuku? Toshinori asked. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 turned to him with an unreadable expression. We'll put up a missing child's case. You'll have to talk about this with Torino and Recovery Girl because you can't hide this. His quirk won't be mentioned as there will bias because of his quirklessness status. I will do everything in my power to find him, but whether if he wants to come back home to you three is up to him, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 said before turning away and called Nizu. Izumi was in tears. Silently she walked to her room. What was her future going to be like? It's dead at night, but the detective doesn't seem to care, so her friends are going to be brought over to discuss their punishments for hurting Izuku. She just wants this entire nightmare to be over and have her brother back. She wants to hug him like a sister would and play together like normal sisters would. She wants to see him smile and geek out about her and her friends again. She wants what they had before they got their quirks back. She wants to be a family again. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 sighs as the phone hangs up. Nizu was on his way with Recovery Girl and Grand Torino to annihilate the Yagis and Izumi's friends. He never thought he would actually be excited to see something like this. But before 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 could think about it any longer, he got a call. Curiously, he looked at the caller's ID. It was Chief Tsuragami. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 groans but picks up the phone nonetheless. Hello, Chief. Sorry, but I'm preoccupied with one of my friend's child going missing, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 said, intending to make the conversation short. Apologies, Tsukachi, but you will be needed to lead this next case, Tsuragami stated. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 was confused. What, why? 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 asked. He heard Tsuragami grunt on the other line and grab something. Well, we found two thugs tied together in an alleyway. Apparently they had tried to rob a kid with dark hair, but that's as much as they could see on the dark, but the kid had taken them out, Tsuragami told. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 was still confused. Okay, but why am I specifically needed on this case? 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 asked. Well, one of the men has a mutant quirk that makes his bone metal. Something that can't be removed. Except when we arrested him, his bones weren't metal. He didn't have a quirk at all, neither did the other man, Tsuragami stated in a low voice. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃's eyes widened. A man with a mutant quirk no longer has his quirk. But that's not possible. The only way that can happen was, well, he was dead. All Might/Toshinori killed him. But he was the only man that could erase a mutant quirk. But the person who did this was a kid. Tsuragami just said so. But that leaves only one option. All for one has a child, 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗃 muttered. Izuku was leaning on a mound of trash playing with his new quirks. Note he had kept the quirks, so it was most likely permanent. So he really did have all for one. Izuku was testing out his quirks because they were so interesting. His metal bones were basic, but looking at the color of them, they seemed to be some kind of titanium alloy. Probably something close to it, as there is no way he'd be able to move around if his bones were titanium. But his electric quirk was a bit more interesting. He could emit a small amount around his body. It wasn't strong, but it did hurt when Izuku was shocked, but it was probably because of his metal bones. But that wasn't the entirety of his quirk's ability. He could turn himself into a lightning bolt. Izuku wondered why the guy he had taken the quirk from hadn't turned into a lightning bolt. He was using his quirk anyway, why not use more of it? The charge would be the same. It was not until Izuku became a lightning bolt that he realized why. He could hardly control it. He could pick a direction to the go, but the point of where he'll land. No clue. Izuku can't seem to transform into a bolt when touching a wall though, probably a limitation from the ions around him. Despite the excitement of analyzing his new quirks and quirk, Izuku was terrified. No more than terrified. He had all for one, which belongs to the sworn enemy of the people with one for all. Could he go back home? Would his family hurt him even more knowing what he was capable of? He didn't doubt. In fact, it was highly likely. How far would they go? Would they kill him? Izuku didn't know he did know that Izumi at least wanted him dead. Would that be good enough to just get rid of him? Izuku thought of his family. All of the times they went on vacation and just forgot him. The snarls and hate-filled looks Izumi and her friends gave him. The tortured fueled days and overall unpleasant life. If he was treated this way by hero parents, top 10 at that, how were other kids treated? Izuku looked down at his hand. He now had power. The power to give and take quirks. Izuku closed his fist and looked up with new determination. He then got up and started scavenged the junkyard. After a bit of searching, he found some old scissors. They obviously weren't in the best of shape and the handles of them were falling apart or had fallen apart. But Izuku didn't care. He ran back inside the caravan. He went to the small mirror inside the caravan and looked at his reflection. He wasn't a Yagi, he never had been as soon as he turned 4. No one wanted a useless Deku like him around. But he wouldn't be the only kid who was tormented because of this. Being ostracized because of something he had no control over. With this new quirk, he could stop this. He could take away the quirks of the privileged who constantly put others down and help those who were bullied and abused like him. He'll be a hero to those who don't meet society's standards of a worthy person. But he can't do that, at least not as Izuku Yagi. Izuku would change who he is, cut all ties with who he once was and become what a hero should be. Izuku started cutting his hair. He didn't stop until his hair was more manageable. There was still a lot, but it was longer everywhere and looked somewhat natural. More curly than tangled. But that didn't matter to Izuku. He looked at himself in the mirror, his eyes alight with determination. He's going to be the best hero, like he had promised himself. It was early in the morning, the sun hadn't even risen yet. But it was nothing but quiet. "You did what to Izuku?" Mitsuki yelled. Masaru and Rei held her back as she tried storming her way to Inko. Recovery Girl and Torino were furious at Toshinori and both hitting him. They wanted to yell at him more for being a hypocrite but couldn't say as there are others in the room. Nizu had gotten the kids all to sit down on the couch with NG, Endeavor right next to him. Izumi, Katsuki, Katsumi, Shoto and Zayato were all looking down. 3 of them were crying and all of them were looking shameful. NG was staring down the 5 kids. A look that held fury and disappointment. Nizu had a smile on his face as he sipped his tea, seemingly happy at the teens' misery. He chuckled. Nizu held one of Izuku's future hero analyses books. He was reading through it with an impressed look. He had requested to see any of Izuku's belongings and Naomasa had only returned with medical supplies, bleach, and a stack of future analyses book. This had enraged the already angry adults of how little Izuku had. Looking at these books, he seemed to really look up to you 5, Nizu said with a sadistic smile. Katsuki growled and looked at the chimera. Yeah, we get we F up rat, so can you please stop rubbing it in our faces? Katsuki said angrily. Oh, shut up rat. You should be bloody blacklisted from hero schools. Mitsuki yelled angrily. She had tears streaming down her face as she cried into husband's shoulder. That may be the right decision, however you also have to consider the environment. These 5, although made the decision to hurt Izuku, they were never stopped or punished. They had done it in front of teachers and school staff and they all looked the other way. If they had done their jobs, Izuku wouldn't have suffered quirk discrimination, which means 𝗧𝗪𝙢 will suffer consequences. But you 5 aren't off the hook, 𝗧𝗪𝗧 stated, glaring threateningly at the 5 teens as he said the last sentence. They all gulped and looked at 𝗧𝗪𝗧 dreadfully. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 chuckled at their faces. You will be blacklisted from every hero school other than mine, Yue. So if you get expelled, that's it. I have no doubts that you kids will pass the entrance exam, but one mishaps of bullying another kid and it will be an immediate expulsion. The first-year teacher also likes expelling students. In fact, he expelled his entire first-year class on the first day. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 smiled menacingly. This made all 5 gulp. So you better do your best. To help you, all 5 of you will attend therapy, and if you end up graduating, the first 3 years of your career, you'll experience half pay, 𝗧𝗪𝗧 said. Do I make myself clear? 𝗧𝗪𝗧 asked in a menacing voice, one that does not match his small and cute appearance. The entire room froze at it and all looked scared at 𝗧𝗪𝗧. The 5 kids all looked pale and nodded their heads. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 laughed and turned away from them. Mitsuki shook herself out of her fright and stood up. What about these 2? They have no excuse. Mitsuki shouted, angrily pointing at Toshinori and Inko. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 sighed and stopped smiling, looking at the 2 with no emotion on his face. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do but subtract their pay grade, 𝗧𝗪𝗧 said. This infuriated Mitsuki. What? Is it because she's AF top 10 hero? Mitsuki shouted angrily. Katsuki, Shoto, Katsumi and Ẓayato all gasped in shock. They knew Rei was Ice Queen and Enji was Endeavor, but they didn't know that Inko was Green Tornado. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 sighed and shook his head. No, she's not the problem in this situation, 𝗧𝗪𝗧 responded. Mitsuki's eyes widened. She looked over and looked at Toshinori. He laughed nervously and looked down. He then yelped as a syringe cane whacked him on the head. Yeah, this idiot is the #1 hero, Gran Torino said, glaring at him. Again the same 4 teens gasped. He was All Might. The #1 hero neglected their own son. They were all stunned. Mitsuki had wide eyes as she stared at Toshinori. As soon as she processed the information of him being All Might, she quickly saw all red. Her face contorted into rage. #1 hero 𝗵𝗃𝗏, she shouted as she ran up Toshinori. The man froze. Rei was only barely able to hold her back. Masaru quickly came up to help, but they were struggling to keep her back. While that was happening, 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍 came back into the room. He saw the ensuing chaos and blinked. He quickly recomposed himself and walked over to 𝗧𝗪𝗧. He bent down to his level. 𝗧𝗪𝗧, sir, but I need to speak with you, Toshinori and Gran Torino privately, he said. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 turned to him, curious, and nodded his head. But first, he turned to Enji. Endeavor here, the Chimera spoke, holding up Izuku's analyses book. The fire hero turned to him and raised his eyebrow. Why? He asked. He grabbed the book and looked at the open page. There was an image of him on it. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 smirked and put his paws behind his back. That's Izuku's hero analyses booklet. I believe the information you'll find in it quite impressive, he said. The 5 teens all widened their eyes at his statement. 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍, deciding it would be better for his sanity to not ask about what 𝗧𝗪𝗧 was talking about, decided to ignore it and focus on the issue he had just been called for. Toshinori, Torino. I need you both to come with me. This is a private matter, 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍 said seriously. The 2 of them looked at him confused and slightly shocked. They both nodded and walked over to them. 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍 led them out of the room and shut the door. He sighed before turning to the 3. 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍, while we're here, will I be charged if I taught Toshinori here a lesson? He asked while glaring at the man. Toshinori gulped and looked pleadingly at 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍. 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍 sighed and shook his head. We'll talk about that later, but right now, 𝗍𝗄𝗎𝗍 said, getting the 3's attention. I just got called by my chief. About an hour ago, they had arrested 2 thugs. They had tried to rob a scrawny kid who was crying in an alleyway. According to one of the thugs, they have a mutant quirk that makes their bones metal. But during the fight, the The kid placed his hand on the man's face and then felt extreme pain. When he could get up again, he realized. He no longer had his quirk, 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗍 said. Toshinori and Torino both looked horrified and Nizu had an unreadable expression. A pit had formed in Toshinori's stomach. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 wasn't dead. But he had to have been. He crushed his head. But 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗍 isn't a liar and he knows that. Which means that a kid with 𝗧𝗵𝗃 is out on the streets, stealing quirks. Why had he openly showed himself now? Wouldn't it have been smarter if they had simply kidnapped men with suitable quirks as they were obviously coincidental targets? A thought then popped into Toshinori's head and it made his stomach drop. What if they were after Izuku? 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗍 sighed and continued talking. The other man has also lost his quirk and neither have received their quirks back yet. It appears 𝗧𝗵𝗃 has either found his successor or had a kid. Which means that he was never killed, 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 said. OCRP. With Izuku on the streets. 𝗧𝗵𝗃's successor is going to be after to him, Grand Torino said. We will need to retrieve Izuku back as soon as possible so he can start training with one for all. The information we have on that kid was that they were small, scrawny dark hair in an afro style, 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 said. Not even a gender. Nizu inquired. 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 shook his head. No, they genuinely couldn't determine if the kid was male or female. Just that they might not even have been a teenager, 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 said. The three were shocked by this. The kid might not have even been a teenager. If it was 𝗧𝗵𝗃's successor, he probably took a kid while they were small and corrupted him. It makes all three feel sick that someone would stoop so low. Although the kid going after Izuku is an almost certainty. I think the biggest problem if they succeed is if they can convert him to their cause, Nizu said. Toshinori whipped his head around to look at Nizu. You don't think he'll become a villain, do you? Toshinori asked shakily. Well, Izuku doesn't know that you're All Might, but 𝗧𝗵𝗃 does. He could use that information to convince Izuku that our hero society is corrupted. Also, the ability to give him a quirk is quite the persuasion over someone quirkless. But it would be horrible if Izuku became a villain, Nizu said. Toshinori raised an eyebrow. Why? Toshinori asked. Grand Torino scowled and kicked Toshinori in the knee. Toshinori yelped and buckled down to his knee. You hypocritical brat. You should know that quirkless doesn't mean useless. Nana should have never given you that quirk. Grand Torino yelled. Toshinori looked at him with fear before looking down. He agreed, he'd been terrible and didn't deserve it. Nizu coughed, gaining the two's attention. Like I was saying, the reason it would be bad for Izuku to become a villain is because of his analyses. I read through his entire future hero analyses and his skills are impressive. Able to match other analyses quirks I've come across, and he is only 13. With a little guidance, he could come up with plans to easily kill heroes and perform serious heist with the knowledge of allies' quirks, Nizu said. The group were all shocked at what Nizu had just said. The Chimera rarely compliments others on their academics because it is so hard to impress him. But with his serious expression, they knew he wasn't joking. 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 collected himself. Well, it looks like finding Izuku is our #1 priority, 𝗧𝗵𝗍𝗍 said. Izuku was still in the junkyard. His hair was all messy and he was in need of a shower, but Izuku can go without for a while. He's next to a beach anyway. If he wanted to bathe, he can go buy some washing supplies. Being in a junkyard isn't as dirty or disgusting as one might think. Well, maybe they are, but at least this one isn't mostly. This place is mostly for old furniture or machinery that stopped working and the people just couldn't be bothered to put it in the actual dumpster. It is disgusting. Izuku would obviously prefer people didn't do that, but right now it's working in his favor. Izuku is currently practicing with his bolt quirk. It would be extremely useful for escaping and running away. Especially his tormentors, as Izuku could normally run away from everyone else, but his old friends and sister is impossible. Katsumi, Shoto and Zyado all have quirks that can attack Izuku at a range even if he could run away. Izumi could just lift him in the air and Katsuki can blast himself forward way faster than Izuku could ever run. Izuku has gotten better at it for the past few hours he's been practicing. He has actually found out some cool things about his quirk. He isn't a bolt of lightning, he is a bolt of electricity. So he can travel through wires or conductive objects. However, the downside is that he is naturally attracted to those conductive objects and will go towards them even if he doesn't want to. His metal bone quirk doesn't really have much information on it. His bones are literally iron now, nothing more or less. It's actually a lot more annoying as he feels sluggish as Izuku of struggling to move himself around. However, the quirk has a built-in strength enhancement, so it isn't impossible for him to move around. It also helps him with natural muscle building as Izuku has to put more effort in to move around. So Izuku guesses it's a win-win. His bolt quirk will help move around, so it isn't that bad. Izuku smiled as he writ in his analyses book on quirks. He finally has one of his own. Well, he doesn't really know much about his quirk, other it being named All for One, allowing him to give and take quirks. It also belongs to his father's arch nemesis, but that isn't really important. Unless he finds out, then Izuku is in trouble. He has so many questions about All for One. Like when he takes quirks from others, it seems like he hurts them. But is it every time Izuku does it, or does it depend if the other person gives consent? What happens when Izuku gives someone a second quirk? Will they die, become sick, their lifespan shorter, or nothing will happen? Does it depend if the quirks are similar or completely different? Can he combine quirks together? How many quirks can he have, and if there is a limit, could Izuku increase it? Izuku doesn't know any of these questions, but desperately wants to find out. Izuku was writing all his thoughts down when something interrupted his thoughts. Izuku looked down and covered his rumbling stomach. Izuku hasn't eaten in a while, and he knows that. He commonly goes without much food for a long while. Rarely actually having large meals, with those meals being leftovers from his sister being picky. But even Izuku has limits on how long he can go without proper food. Izuku sighed and rummaged around in his pocket. He pulled out the money he had, which he so happened to find in between couches. Izuku couldn't actually believe he found more than a few cents. He had $12 ready to be spent. Izuku would rather spend them on notebooks to document quirks or interesting things. But he can't ignore the fact he has to eat. Izuku got up from the junkyard. He had found a basket full of clothes. Some were ripped and generally unwearable, but he had found a nice gray hoodie that felt really nice. Strings of fabrics were everywhere, but Izuku didn't really care. The uniform he was wearing before was in a lot worse condition. So, what was he going to do about that? Would it really matter if he went to school? That place has been the biggest hell hole of his life. Izumi, Katsuki, Shoto, Katsumi, and Ẓayato were all born with amazing quirks, while they all deliberately try and make his life miserable because he wasn't born with one. The teachers don't care, and it's not like he has any friends that'll miss him. Izuku shrugged. He could always go to the library. Izuku walked through the streets with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was getting several looks from passerbys. It was probably looks like he is homeless. Good observations by them, he was in fact homeless. He may as well have been for the past 9 years. Several people were pulling out their phones and suddenly taking phone calls. Izuku just ignored them as he went into a subway. People were still looking at him and then making phone calls. Izuku didn't really look into it, he was just hungry. He ordered a sandwich as cheap as possible before collecting it and leaving. Izuku dug in, taking small bites as he couldn't handle a lot of food at once. It will probably take him a while. Izuku mindlessly walked through the streets as he made his way back to the junkyard. Should he be searching for new quirks to get? A quirk that changes his appearance would help, just to make sure none of his tormentors recognize him on the street. He doesn't want to deal with that without an easy way to get medical supplies, as he no longer has a proper home. Maybe he can get a job. Unlikely someone will be willing to hire a quirkless person. It wouldn't be a good idea to state his actual quirk, so maybe a new name and just say his quirk is Bolt. It would probably be the best idea. Izuku wasn't caring about what was around him and completely zoned it all out. He wasn't brought back into the world until a hand grabbed his shoulder. Izuku flinched at the sudden touch. Luckily, it wasn't the shoulder with Katsuki's burned handprint. Izuku turned around to see who it was and breathed a shaky relief when he saw it was a hero. It was Amplifier. "Hey kid, are you okay?" she asked. Izuku's eyes widened but quickly shook off his shock. Of course, a pro hero would be able to notice he didn't look like every other kid. He has bruises and worn-out clothes, but he can act fine. He's been able to trick Aunt Mitsuki for years, as she was still the only person who kind of remembered his existence and talked to him like he wasn't a piece of trash or fragile. Izuku smiled brightly at the hero. Yes, Amplifier, I'm all good. I was just hungry and got some food, Izuku said earnestly. Which he really was. He was hungry and got some food. He was also good, great in fact. This is probably the best he has been in years. Amplifier didn't look convinced. All right, kiddo. Does your name happen to be Izuku Yagi? She asked. Izuku froze. How did she know about his name? His parents definitely wouldn't have filed a missing persons report, so that wasn't an option. He had only been mildly paying attention but had noticed a lot of people staring at him throughout the day. He had taken 2 quirks from people yesterday, and there is no way the police wouldn't have noticed that. They probably have taken statements from those 2 thugs and now know it's him who did it. Izuku was and no, Izuku stuttered, becoming incredibly scared. Amplifier sighed and smiled softly. She reached out and grabbed Izuku's wrist with a soft yet firm grip. Sorry, that wasn't convincing at all. Come on, Yagi, I'll get you home safe. No one will hurt you, she said and started slowly pulling Izuku along with her. Izuku was terrified. She was taking him home. To the Yagi's house so he'll be safe. But that is the least safe place he could be. They know he has all for one. They would kill him, torture him, make the last moments of his life more painful than the last 9 years combined. He couldn't go there, he had to run. Izuku couldn't even fight back against them. He remembers that his 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗍 had stated that his quirk couldn't be taken. Even if he had taken all of his tormentor's quirks, Izuku still stood 0 chance against All Might. Izuku took in a sharp breath and reeled his arm back and punched Amplifier in the face. Amplifier yelled and let Izuku go. Izuku yelled out an apology before sprinting away. He was on the street and there were several people with mobile phones out. He couldn't use his bolt quirk without accidentally going to one of them, so he needed to get high up. The rooftops. Hey Yagi, stop. I'm trying to help you. Amplifier yelled out. Izuku ignored her and kept running. You aren't though, Izuku thought as he ran. He got into an alley and used to the trash to get to the roof. Izuku reached the top in no time before activating his quirk. Izuku felt a rush of energy around him. He dashed forward before his mind went blank. He didn't know what was happening, but that was normal as he was currently electricity. He just felt fear. Fear that he was now being hunted down. His family knew he had all for one, and they wanted to kill him. The next thing Izuku knew was that he has slammed right into a wall. He yelled as he felt his iron bones rattle from the impact. Perhaps even his nose had been broken. Izuku slid down the wall and hit the ground with his stomach. Izuku groaned as he shakily pushed himself up and raised a hand to his nose. It felt wet. Izuku looked at his hands and saw a lot of blood. Hey, look who came to the party. A male voice yelled. Izuku's eyes widened as he looked over and saw a man with white hair walking up to him. Izuku didn't know what he was doing, but he was too injured to ask. The man didn't seem to care of the state Izuku was in, and it wasn't until he saw their sadistic smile where Izuku started to panic. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗍 sat in his office. Toshinori and Inko sat at the other end of his desk. They were both looking down and tense. Their shoulders on high alert and their legs pushed together. Inko had her hand on Toshinori's leg and Toshinori had his hand on top of hers. They were anxious because 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗍 had called them down with regard to Izuku. He had said they needed to be there as they required an extra set of hands because of the all-for-one successor out on the streets. But he received an unexpected call from another police department. All right, thank you for the information, and you couldn't have called at a more perfect time. Have a good evening, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗍 said before hanging up the phone. He then turned to the 2 Yagis with a very serious expression. Why was that phone call perfect timing, 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗍? Inko asked. 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗍 gave her a quick glare at her, calling him his first name but mostly ignored it. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. That call was from another police department. They had gotten a lot of calls and sent a few heroes out to investigate it, 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗍 said. Both Yagis raised an eyebrow, curious at where this was going. 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗍 sighed at their stupidity. They had caught sight of Izuku, he said. Both parents went wide-eyed and jumped up from their seats. Toshinori leaning over to 𝗵𝗲𝗍 with desperate eyes. Did they get him? Is my boy okay? He asked desperately. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 shook his heads. The pro-hero amplifier tried taking him to the station, but Izuku had punched her in the face and fled. He got onto the rooftops and no one was able to track him, 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said. Toshinori and Inko both looked down, devastated that Izuku had gotten away. This tells us two things though. First one is that he desperately doesn't want to get caught and brought to the police. I'm not sure why he won't make a statement about the neglect you two have put him through though. Probably thinking that no one would believe him, 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said. Does my baby have a place to stay? Don't tell me he is out on the streets, Inko said exasperatedly. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 shook his head. Looking at the condition that every call had said, unlikely. He has cut his hair apparently, but not well, 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said. Inko then started to cry. He'd rather stay on the streets than come home, ahoho, she sobbed. Toshinori moved over and squeezed her into a hug. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 shook his head at her words. Of course Izuku would stay out on the streets than come home. He was abused by his sister and his parents never cared. He might just have one person out there with him, but that can't be guaranteed yet. Other heroes were there to try and look for him, but he was gone without a trace, meaning Izuku knows what he is doing. So we are going to need someone more qualified to find him before All for One's successor does, Izuku says. Does that mean they'll have to know what we did to him? Toshinori asked with a face of concern. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 looked at him unimpressed and gave him a glare. What is more important to you? A single person knowing of the neglect or Izuku? 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said with a rising anger. Toshinori gulped and lowered his head, not making eye contact. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 silently scoffed and stood up and walked to the door. Don't worry, I've known this man for years. He is a fantastic underground hero and perhaps the best, 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said as he left the room. Toshinori and Inko looked at each other with a face of worry and concern. They'd have to tell another pro-hero of their misdeeds to their quirkless child. They desperately wanted to avoid that, but if they are what it takes to bring Izuku back, then they'll deal with it. Izuku deserves love and attention, and when he comes back home they'll give it to him. Toshinori will give him one for all so he can be a hero like he has always wanted and be friends Bakugo and Todoroki twins. The door to the office opened again with two men walking in. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 was one of them, but the other doesn't really fit the description of a hero. He has long black hair that looks like he just woke up, a simple black shirt and pants with a gray scarf twirled around his shoulders. He had massive eye bags and tired red eyes. This was the person that was going to find Izuku. Yagi's this is Eraserhead, 𝗵𝗲𝗍 said. Izuku was terrified. He had just gotten away from the pro-hero amplifier by using his new bolt quirk. But because of his state of delirium and panic, he slammed head first into a brick wall. Izuku's head was bleeding, and even with his new iron bones, Izuku is pretty confident that his nose is broken. But that wasn't Izuku's problem right now. Right now, Izuku was currently being held by someone who seemed quite happy with his arrival. They were a man, pure white hair and deep crimson eyes. They had picked up Izuku, one arm around his neck and the other covering his mouth. For a pipsqueak your size, you are surprisingly heavy, the man said as he picked Izuku up. Izuku was in full panic mode. This guy most certainly wasn't friendly. He's probably like Katsumi, who's smugly happy all of the time except when someone doesn't do what they want. Think Izuku, think. You have to get out of this. Something is telling him that this man will hurt him more than what his tormentors did to him daily. His quirks. Izuku technically has two quirks. One that can turn himself into an electric bolt, but he can't do that if he is covered by something. In this case, that man, so he can only emit weak electricity. Izuku also has metal bones, which has made him heavier, but the man was strong enough to carry him anyway. His punches are harder, except Izuku doesn't exactly know how to throw a punch. He's never had to fight back before, as doing it previously would probably have gotten him killed. But his nails and teeth are sharp though, they can do some serious damage. Izuku then started to electrocute the man. Instead of maybe annoying the man and making him let go or loosen his grip, they started to laugh. Ha, what? Is that all you have, a light tickle? The man laughed. Izuku paled at that. Was his electricity really that weak? It had hurt him a lot when that thug used it on him. Well, he did have the quirk a lot longer than Izuku did. Izuku did also have iron bones at the time, which probably made it feel a lot stronger than what it was. But Izuku still has more up his sleeve. He reaches his hands up and start clawing at the man's arms. The man yelled in shock at the sudden pain. Izuku felt something cold and wet start to drip down his hands. Looking down, Izuku could see he was right. However, something else started to happen. Something started to grow out of the man's arms. They were white but looked dirty. Izuku was still scratching them, but it wasn't doing much. He was only carving small lines in them, like carving your name into a tree. Izuku tried to process what his quirk was. It was obviously a transformation quirk, and it didn't seem like it had hurt the man despite it piercing his skin. So it's something already inside his body. The man's quirk was bones. You little cut your nails one in a while, the man cursed, but he didn't let Izuku go. If anything, his grip tightened as bones now covered his hands and gripped Izuku tightly. Izuku desperately struggled. He was struggling to breathe. He started wailing on the man's arms, but it wasn't doing much. "Hey guys, look what I found," the man suddenly said, his voice only slightly strained from pain but otherwise amused. Izuku opened his eyes and tried to see who the man was talking to, despite the fact he was starting to get black spots in his vision. Izuku's eyes widened at what he saw. Izuku saw 4 more people. One of them was a girl on the ground and bleeding, but despite that, she didn't seem to be in any distress. There was a second man there as well, and he had his foot on that woman's back. The man also has the weird attribute of having purple skin in some areas. There were 2 more women in this spot. One had pure white hair that hung to her waist and crimson red eyes like the man that was currently holding him, making Izuku think that those 2 are related. The second woman, however, didn't have any discernible features because her hair covered her entire face. The only thing that Izuku could really focus on was that she was incredibly skinny. "You found a pipsqueak, he'll be fun to mess around with," the woman laughed. Izuku was losing his consciousness. Izuku couldn't breathe, and every time he tried to loosen the man's grip it only tightened. Izuku had to do anything to try and prevent incredibly pain and potential death. Their quirks. It hit Izuku like a freight train. He can take the man's quirk. It was the reason the man had yet to let go. But how did he do it again? He grabbed them, but Izuku was doing that now and he had yet to steal the man's quirk. He could try somewhere else, not like he has an option. Izuku pulled himself up as much as he could and used his other hand to try and reach up. He put his hand on his attacker's face and gripped it tight. He felt a rush of adrenaline fill him as something entered him. It was something natural but different, flexible yet stiff at the same time as that feeling dropped into Izuku. Izuku gasped for breath as the man who was holding him slumped to the ground. Izuku held his neck and felt a few more cuts than there were before. Izuku was coughing and wheezing as he desperately tried to bring the air back into his lungs that was deprived from him for too long. Izuku shakily pushed himself up. He was low on energy but still able to move. Out of curiosity, Izuku tried activating his new quirk. But immediately upon doing so he felt an immense amount of pain. His iron bones didn't want to comply with what Izuku wanted to do with them. The quirks must be clashing together, making Izuku unable to activate the bone manipulation quirk. Izuku looked up and all 4 others were staring at him. The girl who was probably his sister looked furiously. She grabbed something out of her pocket and Izuku's eyes widened when he realized it was a knife. "What the hell did you do to him, brat?" the woman yelled. Izuku wondered if being stabbed in the arm would hurt him with his iron bones, but he wasn't exactly keen on testing the idea. But instead of the woman charging, she cut her own hand. This confused Izuku until fire appeared in her hand. The woman threw the fire at Izuku. Izuku's eyes widened, but he reacted fast enough. Izuku turned into a lightning bolt and zoomed backwards. Izuku hit the wall and reverted back. Izuku stared at the girl who looked even angrier that he had avoided the attack. The woman raised her hand that was covered in BLD. Izuku watched as her BLD quickly formed into a gun. She must have a creation-type quirk where she can make multiple things from her BLD, including that gun. She pointed it at Izuku. Izuku should really run away, turn into a lightning bolt, and escape from this whole situation. But the girl on the ground Izuku couldn't ignore. Despite the fact she didn't have any emotion, she was obviously being attacked until Izuku got there. So Izuku stared down the barrel of the gun and turned into electricity again. She shot the bullet, but it obviously missed Izuku. Izuku then appeared again, but this time, he was in the air. Izuku kneed the girl directly in the face. She gasped in shock before quickly falling to the floor unconscious. Izuku quickly went up to her and grabbed her face. He felt a weird goop-type feeling go into his body. But there was an exact feeling, like it was constantly changing. Izuku stood up and looked at the two thugs. The man with purple patches of skin then came up to Izuku. His hands that had purple skin turned into purple tentacles and stretched out to attack Izuku. The tentacles grabbed Izuku's hands and grabbed his neck. Izuku started to choke again, except this time was a lot stronger. Izuku felt like his head was about to pop off. Izuku couldn't try and loosen it as the tentacles also held his hands. Izuku tried to think of more ways to save himself as his weak shocking power wasn't doing anything. He had just received a new quirk, one that has the ability to change what their BLD is. Izuku knows he has a lot of BLD all over him. He has some on his hands and face. The woman had turned her BLD into fire. Izuku believes that would be a good idea in this situation. Without wasting any more time, Izuku lit his hands ablaze. The tentacles immediately recoiled and Izuku grabbed the one around his neck. That tentacle let go as well, giving Izuku air once more. Izuku ducked down and jumped back. The man didn't look fazed despite his tentacles being badly burned. Izuku quickly turned into electricity and rushed at the man. The man's eyes widened and he turned his tentacles back into his hands. He brought them up and in front of his face to protect himself. Izuku slammed into him with full force, making the guy stumble back. Thanks to Izuku's electricity, the shock made the guy pull his arms away. Izuku saw his opening and reached forward. He grabbed the man's face and activated his quirk. Izuku watched as the purple skin of the man slowly disappeared and watched as his hand turned from a pale peach to a deep purple. The feeling Izuku had gotten from taking the quirk was slimy and wet, but also brought a numb sensation along with it. Izuku then faced the last thug. Izuku immediately jumped back from fright. He could finally see the girl's face. Her eyes were purple, but that was the least interesting part about her. Piercings and tattoos covered her face. She was currently gnawing her teeth and sprinting at Izuku. Her hair was flying everywhere and it was moving unnaturally, telling Izuku that she was manipulating it. Izuku rubbed 2 fingers on his face, wiping the BLD that was on it to his fingers before flinging it at the girl. The BLD then flared into fire and the girl screamed. Parts of her hair caught on fire and she quickly tried to put it out. Izuku rushed towards her and put his hand on her face. The girl screamed before passing out from the pain. The feeling Izuku got from the quirk was tangled and brittle, making Izuku believe the girl did have a hair manipulation quirk. Izuku then heard someone getting up from the ground. Izuku turned around and watched the last girl backing away. She wasn't shaking or looking at Izuku scared, but her actions reflect that she was scared. Izuku was confused but decided to try and talk to her. "Hey, are you okay?" Izuku asks her. The girl stops and tilts her head. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asks with a monotone voice. Izuku quickly realizes why she was uncomfortable. Izuku had just beaten up 4 thugs that did have strong quirks. They were all just attacking her before he showed up and did incapacitate them all by just touching their head. Izuku quickly shook his head and straightened himself up. No, I was just attacked and then I saw you getting attacked so I thought I'd help." Izuku stuttered slightly as he shook his hands in front of his face, trying to show the girl that he wasn't a threat. The girl nodded. She then started to look around. She was looking at all of the people Izuku had just knocked unconscious. Izuku started to shift to side uncomfortable. The fact that she had 0 emotion on her face concerned and frightened Izuku a bit. She then pointed at the second man, the one that had purple skin, but now Izuku has it, and looked back up at Izuku. "How do you have his quirk now?" she asks. Izuku freezes slightly and looks away. Is he going to admit he stole someone's quirk to a stranger? She wasn't giving any signs of emotions at all. Izuku wasn't really comfortable with sharing the fact that he can steal quirks. People didn't exactly react nicely when he didn't have a quirk. They definitely wouldn't react better if he had the ability to take quirks from others. So he shouldn't be taking quirks from others. Izuku knows the hardships of being quirkless in this day and age. But these people would do the exact thing to others. They use their quirks to cause others pain simply because they are stronger. People like that don't deserve quirks. Izuku will be a better hero than his parents and give people like him a safe place to grow up in. I stole it, Izuku answered in a small voice. He wasn't looking at the girl, too afraid of her reaction. For how long? The girl asked. Izuku chuckled softly and kicked the ground. Until I decide to give it back, Izuku answered. So it's permanent? The girl asked. Izuku nodded his head. Yeah, I guess. My quirk allows me to steal and gift quirks how I please, although I'm still new to the process. I have only recently found out I have this quirk, Izuku stated, rubbing the back of his head. Wait, you could give me a quirk? The girl asked. Izuku stopped and blinked. Wait, are you quirkless? Izuku asked, now facing her. Izuku has never met a quirkless person near his age before. The only other quirkless people he's met are people who are in their 50s. Maybe this person knows what it's like. Unfortunately, the girl shook her head. No, I mean kinda. My quirk is emotive deprive, which means I can't feel anything. It's such an awful quirk and the only good it does is make me immune to pain, the girl said. Izuku's eyes widened. That does sound like an awful quirk, one that Izuku probably would have preferred to be quirkless for instead of possessing it. This girl lost likely has the same. Perhaps he could gift her a quirk. I could give you one of their quirks. Do you want to pick? Izuku asks. The girl nods and points to the girl who had a hair manipulation quirk. I've always wanted a quirk like that, it seems so nice, she said. Izuku nodded his head and walked over to her before stopping. I've actually never given a quirk to anyone before, but I do know taking a quirk hurts. I'm also not sure how quirks work if someone has multiple. I know I'm okay because of my quirk's natural buffer, the girl shook her head. Take your time, if it takes me passing out to get a quirk that doesn't make me emotionless, I'll take it, the girl said. She then sat down on the ground and crossed her legs. Izuku nodded and then tried to focus. His quirk allows him to figure out the abilities of other quirks he's taken, so can he figure out his quirk? Izuku paused and opened out his palm. The girl's eyes widened as lights appeared in Izuku's hand. A dark gray light with swirls of black going around it. 6 lights appeared in the dark light Izuku was forming in his hand. Izuku could feel all of the quirks. Metal bones, bolt, bone mutate, hemomorphy, tentacles, hair grow. Izuku can feel the connections between 2 of his quirks, but he'll get back to that later. Izuku dives into his quirk. Izuku sees code, unwritten code. A lot of it. But Izuku has a limit, and it looks like he is already at it. But Izuku looks deeper into it. Deeper into his quirk. Izuku then finds something. Consent. If the other person consents, they can take and give a quirk with no pain and Izuku doesn't need to grab their face. No harm will be done. Actually, Izuku could take the girl's quirk with no consequences. Currently his bone mutate quirk is out as he has hit his limit with how many quirks he can have at once. So if he took the girl's quirk, it wouldn't have any effect on Izuku. With that question sorted, Izuku then goes to the hair grow quirk and takes a look. It's a simple hair manipulation quirk that doesn't do much more than other hair manipulation quirks. But then Izuku notices a quick detail. Izuku can rapidly increase the change of his hair color, making it turn gray faster than it normally would. Well, these guys will probably go to the police, so Izuku will need to alter his hair. The girl on the ground becomes shocked when Izuku's hair turns white and becomes slightly longer. The light in Izuku's hands then disappears and he opens his eyes again. You can change your hair color? The girl asks. Izuku shrugs. Kind of, only white as I made it essentially older faster, Izuku answered. The girl nodded. Izuku took a step towards her and held out his hand. Give me your hand, I can give you a new quirk and take your old one away, Izuku said. Wait, you want me quirk? The girl asked, seemingly confused. Izuku shook his head and smiled. I've hit my limit on my quirk so it won't be activated for a while, Izuku said. The girl nodded and raised her hand. Izuku grabbed her hand and shot out the hair grow quirk into her body. Before Izuku let go, however, he felt her quirks start to attack each other, not liking the idea of having two completely different quirks in her system. Izuku quickly took her emotive deprive quirk and immediately felt it lock. Izuku let go of her hand and looked at her. She had her eyes wide open. She had a bit of her hair in her hand and made it grow. Izuku watched for the first time her face showing emotion. Her eyes had widened in excitement and tears were bringing on her eyes. She looked up to Izuku and quickly stood up. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," the girl said and squeezed Izuku in a hug. The girl was a lot taller than Izuku and his head went immediately into her breast. Not that the girl noticed Izuku's embarrassment. After that, Izuku and the girl talked. He found the girl's name was 𝗵𝗃𝗲 and she was 18 and had suffered bullying her entire life because of her quirk. These were the main bullies, with the two boys being the older brother of both the other girls. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 worked at a cafe nearby, and since Izuku didn't have a phone to contact her, he could go there whenever he wanted to talk. After they tied the four up, 𝗵𝗃𝗲 called the police and Izuku quickly left, as you know. Izuku Yagi wanted. Izuku was making his way home with a new jacket he scabbed from the girl who had hair grow. She was the same height as Izuku, so her jacket fit. While Izuku was walking, he started looking deeper into his quirks, trying to learn more about his new quirks. Tentacles. The purple patches on his skin can make Izuku create tentacles. He can only make 2 tentacles at a time without causing strain on his body. Izuku can also make tentacles form on flat surfaces, except Izuku will only be able to keep them active for a very short period of time. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 grants Izuku to change their BLD to whatever he wants. Fire, metal, acid, light and plenty more. However, Izuku needs to be injured to utilize their quirk, so it won't be something Izuku will use too often with a support item to help. Lastly was bone mutate. Very simple, Izuku can manipulate their bones however they wish, and drinking milk keeps them healthy and strong. However, the quirk seems to have problems with his already established metal bones quirk. The two different quirks clash, making Izuku unable to use that quirk. However, Izuku had felt a connection to those two quirks. The reason why, as Izuku found out, he confused his quirks. Izuku had opened his palms and 2 lights glowed in his palm. Izuku pushed them together and a new quirk was formed. Heavy skeleton. Izuku can manipulate his bones however he wants and they are still metal. Izuku makes it home with a bright smile on his face. Although he did have a concussion and he'll have to fix that, but right now, Izuku is going to test out his new quirks. Aizawa and 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗃 sat in 𝗵𝗃𝗃's office. The Yagis had both recently left and Aizawa had left to get a coffee. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 can tell that the man is furious, and if it wasn't for Izuku being an innocent child, he would have ignored the case. So just because those two are top 10 heroes, they get off with no prison sentence. Aizawa asks with seething anger. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 asked and nods his head. It will cause a lot of uproar and chaos if All Might was arrested, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, making Aizawa scoffed. So we have no clue on how to find this kid because his parents have forgotten him for 9 years, Aizawa said angrily. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 shakes his head. Not quite. Izuku has future hero analyses booklets, so we can look at those to look at the boy's thought process. And this, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said. Aizawa raised an eyebrow as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 bends down underneath his desk. He then comes back and puts something on the table. These are painkillers. Powerful ones, you can only be administered these at hospitals. So perhaps we can find out who gave him these, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said. Aizawa didn't say anything. He leaned forward and grabbed the painkillers. He read over the label before pocketing it. I know someone who can give these out. I suggest we pay them a visit, Aizawa answered. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 nods and writes that down. As he was doing that, however, he receives a phone call. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 raises an eyebrow and picks the phone up and puts it to his ear. Hello, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 speaking, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 says. Hello 𝗧𝗵𝗃, it's tsurugame. 4 more people have been found without quirks, he answers. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 groans and bangs his head on the table. Izumi, Shoto, Katsumi and Zayato had all decided to a cafe to hang out. They had also asked Katsuki to come, but he declined. None of them had really been the same after Izuku ran away and their parents figuring out what they had done. Their punishments from Nizu was that all of their recommendations were removed, Not that Katsuki and Katsumi had won in the first place. But they had to attend villain rehabilitation program as a volunteer. They each had to go to a different one or one at a different time, so they weren't in the same area while helping others. Despite them thinking it would SCK, they quickly found out that almost all of the villains there suffered quirk discrimination. Not only that, but despite their records of crime, they seemed to be genuinely nice people who had nowhere to go but with the wrong crowd. They were a lot worse than these villains, and they had been told that they were destined to be heroes all of their life. It made them feel even worse. The group also had to attend therapy, which was weird and difficult. They know what they did was wrong, but that doesn't change the fact that they have seriously inflated egos. Katsumi especially. The group of 4 all sat down. "Hey guys, how are you all going?" Izumi asks with a smile. Katsumi gives her a dead look. "All right, I guess despite our circumstances," Shoto answers. 𝗧𝗏𝗄 nods her head. Katsumi groans and shoves herself back on the chair, causing it to scrape across the ground. This caused the others' heads all to turn towards her. "How do you think it's been? You can live a normal life at home as your parents also acted horribly towards Izuku. You too still have your siblings that don't have a bad bone in their body. Do you know what I have? A pushover father. My mother loved Izuku more than she'll ever love either me or Katsuki, and learning what we did to him to try and keep him safe made her furious. She refuses to even be in the same room as us. Our father doesn't help as he's too scared with disagreeing with Mum. We have to cook dinner ourselves now, and if we try to talk to her, she just doesn't respond." Katsumi says, slamming her hands down on the table for emphasis. Izumi sighs at her friend's reactions. She guessed it would be like this. Both her and Katsuki have always acted like king and queen, even having loyal followers at school. She's always cocky and on top. Only her mother and Auntie Inko does she respect. So when Izuku ran away, she lost it. However, Katsuki wasn't acting the way Izumi had, though he would. He had become oddly silent and avoids his group. Izumi finds this strange, as Katsuki had always liked to be in the spotlight, which was why he was Izuku's main tormentor. He had to be the best. But now he's faded into the background, refusing hangouts and no longer responding to text messages. "Yeah, I do understand. My mother has become a lot more stricter with us. However, Dad is a different story. He seems distressed and upset with himself. I think it might be with the whole Toya thing," Shoto says, lowering his head near the end. Izumi and Katsumi notice 𝗧𝗏𝗄 cover her mouth and look further down. Toya is obviously a touchy subject. They don't remember much about him as he committed suicide when they were still young. But the main memories they have of him is Toya protecting Izuku from being beaten by them. They don't know to the full story, and they probably won't ask. "Did you ask why Kacchin didn't come, Kacchin?" 𝗧𝗏𝗄 asks. Katsumi scoffs and leans back in her chair. "Hell if I know." The bud is being silent. "I don't know what the F is wrong with him. He always enjoyed hurting Izuku the most and has never liked the old hag yelling at him, so I'm not sure what the hell has gotten into him," Katsumi said, shaking her head. Izumi sighed and lowered her head. "Things have become a lot more complicated since Izuku disappeared. I wish they find Izuku. Even though he probably won't forgive us as he got to the point of running away, but at least it'll solve some of the problems," Izumi said with a forced smile. 𝗧𝗏𝗄 doesn't seem to be fond of the idea of not being forgiven, while Shoto nodded with his usual stoic expression. Katsumi, however, looked indifferent. "What is it, Kacchin?" Izumi asks. Katsumi huffs and shakes her head. "It's stupid, but Katsuki thinks that Izuku is too smart to be found," Katsumi says. This does intrigue the other 3. "Really? I know Izuku was a lot more intelligent than I gave him credit for, but I don't believe he would be smart enough to live off of the street for too long," Shoto said. Katsumi snorts and shakes his head. "Yeah, but that's more. The bit more of what the moron said was that Izuku had either planned a runaway so he knew what to do, or if he didn't he'd find a way to get out of almost all situations. I'm not sure where he got that idea, but it's stupid," Katsumi said. Then she stood up. "I'll buy us drinks and food, I'm starving," she groans as she walks to the counter. Katsuki was in his room. For the past couple of days he had barely left his room. He had spent it thinking. He had always been king, told by everyone he'd be the number hero no matter what. But after taking the time to think, He's no hero, not even close. In his head it was a good idea teaching the nerd a lesson. His dream was unobtainable and he was too nice for his good. So getting all in his face and tell him that he's a worthless nobody sounded like a good idea at the time. Katsuki had always been the top, so he'd be Izuku's top bully. However, that wasn't his reason for doing that to Izuku. He did care for the nerd despite his villainous actions. If he hurt Izuku the most, the others would lay off of him. It was what he did while they were still young and kind of kept that habit up all the way now. No one had ever stopped him, in fact he was encouraged. So naturally he thought it was a good idea. Oh, how he couldn't be more wrong. His other idiot friends think that him coming home will be the best for both them and Izuku. But Katsuki knows the truth. He knows Izuku will do everything in his power to get away or lock himself in his room and refuse to come out. Izuku may not realize this himself, but he is quite good at planning and thinking under pressure. Good at both talking to people or getting away. It just didn't work on Katsuki. Out of all of his friends, he knew Izuku the best. Not well by any means, but the best. He knew Izuku was intelligent and could think of complicated solutions off of anything in seconds and pick up small details like it was BLD covering a room. Katsuki had read a few of Izuku's books out of curiosity and he knew he was a genius. Katsuki was just too proud to admit it. He'd also hung out with Izuku the most out of any of his friends. His mother loved him and have him come over a lot despite the fact he refused on several occasions for being a burden. During this time, Katsuki had never yelled or hit him once. It was a safe place that Katsuki didn't think that hurting him here would do any good, not including his mother in the equation. Katsuki knew the police or heroes wouldn't find Izuku. Especially if they found out he was quirkless, they'd give up the search immediately. Katsuki had the best bet of finding the nerd out of anyone, and he knew it. Which is why he had several images over a board. Izuku had been found in a certain area but managed to escape. He had cut his hair that obviously hadn't been from a barber, which mean he had access to supplies. And he knows the damn nerd wouldn't steal a damn penny. So he was probably near a dump or had found someone willing to give him some stuff. Katsuki doesn't know which one, but he swears he'll find Izuku. Not to bring the damn nerd home but to apologize. He's already hurt Izuku enough. He doesn't need to do any more damage. Izuku walked through the street with his new jacket that he may or may not have stolen. But in his defense he had no choice. He doesn't have much clothes and he was just recently discovered by the heroes, and he can't let them take him home. They'll find out his quirk is all for one and he has been taking the quirks of thugs. Which is why he is also thankful he had that hair grow quirk to alter his hair. He likes it white instead of green. As to why he was walking through the street, well, he was going to 𝗵𝗃𝗲's cafe, the girl he had helped yesterday. Maybe they could be friends. Izuku isn't really good in social situations, only knowing how to persuade others to leave him alone or that he is fine. He doesn't even know if him and that girl even have a friendship. But Izuku hopes that they do and that she is currently on shift so he doesn't look like an idiot. Perhaps he could also be given free food by her as he doesn't exactly have much money to use. Izuku does also feel bad that his main reason to go here was in hopes of getting free food but sue him for being a little bit selfish once in a while. Izuku walks into the cafe he was told that she works at and entered. Izuku looked around, trying to not make himself noticeable and actually paying attention to others this time. Because last time he didn't got him nabbed by a hero. Izuku won't let that happen again. He walked into the cafe and immediately spotted 𝗵𝗃𝗲 working. She had a smile on her face that made Izuku happy knowing that this was probably her first time smiling because of her dumb quirk. Izuku also was thankful that he had hit his limit with his quirk for the time being so he didn't have to give this wretched quirk to anyone else and he wasn't affected by it. Izuku walked over to her and 𝗵𝗃𝗲 noticed. "Hey Izuku, glad to see that you came." 𝗵𝗃𝗲 smiled brightly. Izuku returned her smile. "Hey 𝗵𝗃𝗲, it's good to see you smile. How have you been?" Izuku asks. 𝗵𝗃𝗲's smile dwindled slightly but it didn't disappear. "Well, I'll have to be called to the police because of my whole quirkless thing. But there isn't much they'll get out of me. Don't worry, I won't reveal your little secret Izuku," 𝗵𝗃𝗲 said, coming closer to Izuku and whispering the last part. Izuku couldn't help but be thankful for that. The two continued to talk, 𝗵𝗃𝗲 gifting Izuku a free cookie. It wasn't much, but Izuku wasn't going to complain. He found out that they were looking for a singer to entertain the crowd at night. Izuku was offered, but he has no singing ability, so he just left the offer floating. The two were having a nice time until a scream caught the two's attention. "What was that?" Izuku asked. "I'm not sure, can you go check that out?" 𝗵𝗃𝗲 asked. Izuku nodded his head and left the cafe. The cry sounded like it was on the other side of the cafe, so Izuku walked into the alleyway that led to the back. Cautiously, Izuku peeked around the corner. There was 4 people in the alleyway. 3 of them were girls. One had an appealing white dress and golden blonde hair. The second was a girl with jet black hair and a red skirt, and the last one had blue hair and blue shirt and skirt. They were standing in front of a boy who was trapped in a box of light. His skin was jet black and he had dyed green hair. Izuku watched as the girl with golden hair crouched down and started tapping on the box of light. "Hey there, freak. How does it feel to be caged? You better get used to it. Things like you should have never crawled out of that hole," the girl said. The boy curled further into himself and pushed himself up against the wall. The girl with black hair started to laugh. Izuku felt incredibly angered. But he couldn't just charge in. Unless Izuku was going to kill them, they were going to know what he looks like. The only reason Izuku wasn't worried about that before, because when the guy had grabbed him, he already knew what he looked like. In this situation, Izuku would attack them and they'd have full view of him. It's not like he can add articles of clothing to himself whenever he wants. But what if wasn't clothes? Izuku hasn't really tested his new heavy skeleton quirk, but the idea should definitely allow him to make a makeshift mask. Izuku stepped back and focused on that quirk. He can feel his bones shifting uncomfortable underneath his skin before slowly, something cold is touching his skin. Izuku stopped. He reached up and touched his face. It was hard and metallic. It had worked. Izuku then put his hood up over his head before he walked into the alleyway. "What's going on here?" Izuku asked, making his voice as deep as possible. All 3 girls turned around. The girl with golden blonde hair looked at Izuku, annoyed with her bright blue eyes. But Izuku also notices another detail: her freckles were glowing. Izuku looked at the box again and saw that the corners had a small orb of light. She was probably the one who created the box, and her quirk probably works similarly to constellations. The girl with black hair looked confused and upset as she narrowed her eyes at Izuku. Izuku then looked over to the last girl with blue hair. She looked scared. She looked around at her friends before working backwards. Odd, she doesn't seem the same compared to the other 2. "None of your business, pal. Unless you want to be stuck like the freak over there," the girl with golden hair said. Izuku frowned but got an idea. She seems to be quirk bias, and her quirk is probably flashy and effective for hero work. So she'd obviously be a prick about it because no one is going to stop her. So Izuku is willing to try something. "You think you're stronger than me? Let's compare and see if you're as good as you seem to think," Izuku said. The girl smiled smugly and walked over to Izuku. The girl with the blue hair, however, put her arm cautiously on the obvious leader's shoulder. "Wait, I don't think it's a good idea," she said quietly. The girl frowned before elbowing the girl in the face. She yelped and clutched her nose before falling to the ground. Izuku widened his eyes in shock. That girl was only trying to warn her but ended up getting hit. "Shut up, I'm the best and you know it. Don't try and act like you're better than me," she said angrily before turning back to Izuku with a smug smile. She walked up to him with her hands on her hips. "So you think you're hot, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗲? What's your quirk?" she asks. Based all around her quirks, Izuku wasn't surprised. He can tell who those types of people are by just being around them. It isn't entirely their fault, as everyone, including teachers, encourage their actions their entire life. But she acts differently. Izuku isn't exactly sure why or how he can tell, but it's just a sense that he is getting from her. He doesn't understand, but he isn't going to ignore his gut instinct. Izuku raises his hand and points his palm upwards. "Are you sure you want to test what I can do?" Izuku asks. "Tora, please don't," the girl with blue hair pleads from the ground. Tora ignores her and smirks at Izuku. She raises her hand and places it on top of Izuku's. "Go ahead, you get one shot before I kick your butt," she said. Izuku smirks as he feels her quirk loose from the consent she has given him. Without any hesitation, Izuku takes the girl's quirk. Izuku watches as the freckles on the girl's face stop glowing and her box disappear instantly, freeing the boy with black skin. Izuku smirks, raises his hand, showing her a glowing light. It was white with golden swirls covering it like an atom. "Thanks for your quirk," Izuku said. The girl's eyes widen, fear flashes across her face. She reaches up to her face and starts picking at her freckles. Izuku presumes something is supposed to happen. When nothing does, she looks at Izuku with unimaginable fury. "What the F did you do to me? Give it back," she yelled. Izuku shook his head and brought his hand up to his chest, closing his hand. "Don't think so," Izuku said, feeling a sense of pride at the look of horror on the girl's face. Izuku knows it was wrong, but people like this, people who believe they are heroes, yet abuse others, finally getting served justice, is pure pleasure for Izuku. It's justice. The second girl then looked furious. She raised her hand and a spear that seemed to be formed of pure energy appeared in her hand. "Give her back her quirk, you villain," she yelled and threw the spear. The spear crashed Izuku in the face, making him stumble back a step, but thanks to his metal mask Izuku was fine. Izuku then grew more metal on his body. He made claws and gave himself iron boots. Izuku crashed down before charging at the girl. Izuku moved incredibly fast. Faster than what the girl could do to react. Izuku extended his hand and grabbed her face. The girl then screamed before dropping to the floor. He had taken her quirk. "MC calling the police," the blonde girl announced with a shaky voice. Izuku turned around and looked at her. The girl yelped before turning around and sprinting away. Izuku sighed and looked down to the ground where the unconscious girls lay. Izuku withdrew parts of his quirk but kept his mask on. He then looked up to the other two who both looked terrified. "Hey, can you get your friend somewhere?" "She'll wake up in about an hour," Izuku asked. The blue-haired girl flinched and looked down at her friend. She looked back up to Izuku. "Why are not going to attack me?" the girl asked. Izuku shook his head. "No, I have deemed these two unworthy of their quirks. You're different, so you can keep yours. Now go, I don't have all day," Izuku said. The girl nodded frantically. She scrambled over to her friend and picked her up. She then quickly left the alley without looking back. Izuku then turned to the boy with black skin who was now not looking so scared and was staring at Izuku with wonder. "Why did you help me?" the boy asked. "Why wouldn't I help you? You're human like everyone else. You don't deserve to be ostracized for being born," Izuku answered sympathetically. The boy looked up at him with pure shock and amazement. "Thank you," the boy said, not sure on what to say. Izuku chuckled and sat down. He's probably not good with talking to people. Exactly like him. "Hey, what's your name?" Izuku asked. The boy flinched before smiling sheepishly. "Akito Mabinori," the boy answered. Izuku decided to take a risk. He seems like a good guy and Izuku kind of needs friends. Despite having all for one, he does need other people to survive, no matter how much planning he has. "Do you have any friends?" Izuku asked. Akito looked down and shook his head. "Do you want to be mine?" Izuku asked. Akito looked up, shocked at what Izuku had just said. "Wait, really?" the boy asked, not believing it. Izuku nodded. He took his hoodie off, revealing his white hair. He then started removing his metal mask, revealing what he actually looks like. His skin was a light gray and his eyes were an emerald green. He had small purple areas on his chin and triangles on his cheek. Izuku then outstretched his hand. "Izuku, let's be friends," Izuku says with a wide smile. The two had then started to hang out. After Akito teleported them away to avoid the police that was coming to the scene. Izuku had found out what his quirk was. It was called Shadow Port, which allows him to teleport to dark areas. A side effect from his quirk is that his skin is permanently black, and because of that and his somewhat villainous quirk, he has been bullied his entire life. Well, not anymore. They had hung out the next day as well. They had gone around the park with Akito buying fish and chips. Izuku was incredibly thankful. They had a good time and Izuku was happy. He just needed to find a job and a way to change his identity. He'll need help with that, but he's got time. With his change of looks, he'll last for a while before they catch on. Izuku and Akito had said goodbye before going their separate ways. Izuku had considered taking 𝗧𝗃𝗧𝗏 back to his house, but Izuku didn't want him to know that he lives in a dumpster. Also, the fact that 𝗧𝗃𝗧𝗏 doesn't know he is Izuku Yagi, the very one who is missing, doesn't help either. If he ever finds out, however, he can always just bluff and say that kid was quirkless while he wasn't. Some people at 𝗧𝗪𝗎 had said that he was quirkless and the case lost a lot of traction, which Izuku was thankful for. They don't know he has all for one. But that doesn't change the fact that his family knows. He can't go home, he can't. As Izuku was walking, his thoughts were distracted by a scream. Izuku, being the hero he was, ran towards it. Aizawa and 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 got out of the car. They had stopped in front of a small building near the dock. Aizawa had said that this place sells the painkillers that Izuku had. So this was their first place of investigation. Aizawa walked to the door with 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 in tow, then knocked. Not wasting any time. After a few seconds, the door opened, revealing a woman. She had long purple hair done up in a ponytail. She had black glasses and a white coat on. She looked like a doctor, but why wasn't she working in the hospital? The woman looked at Aizawa and smiled. Good evening, Eraserhead and Detective. Is something the matter? She asked, concerned, as soon as she noticed 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 behind Aizawa. Aizawa nodded. Yeah, Doc, can we come in? Aizawa asked. Of course, Doc said, moving to the side and letting the two in. Aizawa and 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 thanked her, the latter removing his hat. So, what is this about? Doc asked. Aizawa turned to her. Well, you've heard of the missing kid Izuku Yagi. He had access to powerful painkillers that only can be administered in hospitals. You're the only person outside of the hospital can administer it, Aizawa said. 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 was now beginning to understand. Aizawa had left him pretty much in the dark. She was an underground doctor. Not many people do this, as it's just less pay. Severely less pay. Did you give him the painkillers, ma'am? 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 asked, wanting to use his quirk. Doc shook her head. Sorry, it wasn't me. I only give those to one person, Doc answered. 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 nodded his head. His quirk did not activate. Aizawa looked over to him and 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 gave him a thumbs up. Is it possible that this person gave Izuku these drags? 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 asked. Plus, I guess, but he isn't the type. I can ask him though, Doc said. Can you get him here? 𝗬𝗍𝗧𝗏 asked. Doc shrugged. Don't know, the guy is pretty elusive and uncooperative. Even if he does come, he won't be so happy, as he has a deep hatred for heroes, Doc answered, looking over to Aizawa. Aizawa narrowed his eyes. Try me, was all he said. Doc just sighed and went to her desk. Let me call him, she said. Izuku sprinted to where he heard the scream. The scream had been down an alleyway. Izuku looked down the corner and his blood ran cold. Two bodies laid in the alleyway. One of them wasn't that far from the entrance, while the second one was all the way down at the end. However, there was someone else down there. They were a girl, couldn't be older than Izuku himself. They had blonde hair done into two messy buns at the top of her head. She was wearing a small skirt and a cream-colored cardigan. But what she was doing chilled Izuku. She sat atop of that dead body. They were pouring out blood and it covered a lot of her clothes. She held a knife covered in lots of blood and was adamantly licking it. Izuku had to do something, but he didn't know what. This girl had killed two adults and it looked like with little issue. What was her quirk? From how much Izuku can see from her, there isn't much he can determine. He had to stop her. Izuku can't allow a murderer run free, and this person seems giddy about murdering others. But what was Izuku going to do? She was obviously dangerous and very capable at what she does. Even with his quirks, it might not be good enough to take her down. His new quirk. Izuku had completely forgotten about it. The quirk from that girl with the glowing freckles. The one he had to save 𝗧𝗃𝗧𝗏 from. Izuku hadn't had time to test it out, but he knows he produces light from freckles that connect together to create barriers. Luckily for Izuku, he has plenty of freckles to use. He also had the energy spear quirk, but he currently can't use it. Not until he figures out how to increase his quirk capacity. That reminds Izuku. He knows this may not be the best time to be thinking about his quirk. There are two dead people with a murderer sucking the blood out of one of them. But Izuku knows no matter how hard he tries, his curiosity will take over him no matter what. Can he take quirks from dead people? It isn't known how quirks work when people die, if they disappear or just sit there, unable to activate. Izuku knows mutant quirks don't disappear after death, but that wasn't too much of a leap to make. But it was obvious that neither of these people have a mutant quirk, so they either have a transformation or emitter quirks. Can he still take their quirk at post-mortem? Izuku slowly creeps into the alleyway, not wanting to alert the girl of his presence. He got low and reaches his hand towards the body before stopping. This person was dead and he was about to touch them. It was disgusting. Izuku had only now realized the seriousness of this situation. He wanted to puke. The sight before him was horrendous, but he had to hold out. This was a murder situation and he had to stop her before anyone else got hurt. If he wanted to be a hero, he had to get used to these situations. He had to know how to deal with these situations because no matter how good people are, there are so many people who are way worse. Izuku covered his eyes and touched the man. Izuku presumed he didn't need to grab the man's face as he couldn't deny Izuku consent. Izuku felt the familiar rush of a quirk going into his body. The feeling, however, felt fat and refreshing. Izuku was confused at the feeling but couldn't delve deeper into it. He'd be on it all day trying to figure out his quirk when he can't even use it. Izuku looked up to the girl to see her stabbing the dead body again and licking the BLD off of her knife. So her knife was obviously her weapon and use of attack. The body next to Izuku was covered in cut and stab wounds, so if he can protect himself from that he should be fine. His heavy skeleton quirk should protect him, however if she has some type of speed quirk, there will be a problem. Izuku will become slower the more metal he creates on his body, and if he can't defeat this girl fast enough. When he gets too tired, the metal slowly disappears back into Izuku's body and leave Izuku immobile. It's a bad drawback if Izuku can't defeat his opponent before that happens. But Izuku always has other quirks he can use like Bolt, Tentacles, Hemomorphy, and Constellation. They are all more complicated to use and Izuku still needed more practice. But in this situation he has to try. Izuku puts his hood up and activates Heavy Skeleton. Iron grows on his body, covering parts of his shoulder, legs, and ribs. He creates claws on his hands that act as a weapon he can defend himself. Izuku steps up and starts walking to the girl, alerting her of his presence. Izuku expected the girl to be shocked, either become panicked that someone else had saw them or become eager to silence him. But the girl lit up like a Christmas tree. Izuku watched as her golden cat-like eyes locked onto him and seemed to glow in crazy happiness. Izuku stopped in his tracks as he watched this crazy girl stand up and start jumping with joy. "Ooh, a new friend. However, you're hiding your face from me. If we want to get to know each other, we have to be more honest with each other," the girl said in a sultry voice that made Izuku shiver. Izuku wasn't sure what was going on, but he didn't like it. The girl got down into a running stance before sprinting at Izuku with her knife ready to stab him. Izuku was surprised. This girl was fast, like crazy fast. Izuku barely had time to raise his arms in defense as she stabbed him. Her knife clanged with his metal bones. Izuku swung his claw at her, but she ducked with ease. Izuku felt something cut his ear. Suddenly, he became aware that his hood had been hit off, giving the girl full view of his face. Izuku felt something wet slide down the side of his face and Izuku noticed the girl's arm. It looked like she had just thrown something, but it couldn't have been her knife, it was still in her hand. Unless she has more. She definitely has more than one knife. The girl saw him before widening her eyes in excitement. She hopped back, which scared Izuku, and started hopping up and down excited. "Oh my god, you're so cute," she squealed, which both scared and confused Izuku. This girl was insane. She then smiled widely at Izuku, too widely. Izuku saw her fangs and that's what clicked for Izuku. She needs BLD for her quirk. This girl was crazy fast, so her quirk probably increased her speed if she consumed BLD. Izuku had assumed she had a speed quirk because of the way she moved. It did confuse Izuku why there wasn't a clear activation notice. Most quirks have visual activations like their eyes glow or they have an aura of light. But she didn't have anything, which confused Izuku. It was possible she didn't have one, but that was very unlikely. For example, Izumi's body glows gold and the objects she manipulates have the same light of aura. But since she has to consume BLD to activate her quirk, it makes more sense. Izuku has heard of a few facts about BLD quirks. Like they have to have fake BLD made to satisfy the thirst of wanting to drink some. Izuku wonders if others have stronger feelings to consuming BLD than others. Does this girl have a problem like that? But you'd look cuter with a bit more red, the girl then stated, her eyes narrowing on Izuku dangerously. Guess those thoughts will have to wait. Izuku quickly turned into an electric bolt and attacked the girl before she got too close. Unfortunately, electricity is unpredictable and he missed, slamming into the wall. Izuku growled and pushed himself off the wall. He then felt something sharp hit the back of his neck. Izuku gasped as he was pushed back into the wall. The pain was null from the knife entering a purple patch of skin. He felt the knife hit the spine in his neck. If it wasn't metal, Izuku would be in trouble. But luckily it was. Izuku activated his quirk and broke the knife with his bones. The girl then backed away, confused on what happened. Izuku didn't let this opportunity slide as he turned around and activated his quirk. A tentacle formed from his left and it shot out and grabbed the girl. She couldn't avoid it before being lifted into the air. The girl started to struggle. Izuku watched as she reached into her shoe and grabbed another knife and started stabbing the tentacle. Luckily, Izuku couldn't feel it. Izuku used his right hand and reached for his face. His freckles started to glow. He threw out 8 balls of light. The girl slashed the tentacle and managed to release herself. She fell towards the ground but noticed small lights floating. She fell towards them, and when she was in between them all, they connected. The girl landed on a translucent golden barrier of light. She looked around frantically, her crazy smile vanished completely. The same barriers surrounded her completely. She started banging on them but nothing happened. She then stabbed them and got the same result. A sinking feeling registered in her chest. She was trapped. Caught. Izuku sighed in relief as he sat down and put his hand over his heart. Even with 5 quirks, he still struggled to take her down. He really needs to get some practice in actually fighting. He knows he can't rely solely on quirks, but he's never had the opportunity to get lessons before. Now, what to do about this girl? Izuku looked up at the girl trapped in his constellation only to be met with a strange sight. She was crying. It was a complete 180 to what Izuku had seen before from the girl. Perhaps she was upset she was defeated, or was it something else? Izuku got up and walked towards her. The girl didn't look up at him. Hey, why are you crying? Izuku asked. The girl cracked a sad smile and Izuku couldn't help but to feel bad. He hadn't even heard her response yet and she had just killed people. What was he thinking? It's over. I'm caught. I'll be put into jail for all of the stuff I've done, the girl said. She then started to cry harder. Izuku watched as the girl started to wail, curling herself into a ball. I'm so sorry, so sorry. I never wanted to turn out like this, she sobbed, her head down in her arms. Izuku felt his heart crack. She doesn't have control of her actions. Izuku has read up a lot of cases and he has seen several people forced into crime. Mainly from their quirk that alters their appearance and makes their needs different from others, like people with bug quirks. Her quirk probably also got her ostracized as well. People are cruel and her quirk probably required help from a quirk counselor which she didn't get. Izuku knows he should call the police and arrest her. She killed 2 people. But Izuku can't help but feel that's the wrong choice. It wasn't entirely her fault she killed those 2 people. If Izuku wants to help people, punishing others for something they can't control won't help anyone. Not to mention he has no way of contacting the police and he is still kind of wanted by the police right now. Izuku sighs and puts his hand on the barrier. Hey, you need BLD for your quirk, right? Izuku asked. The girl stopped crying, only sniffling. She looked up at Izuku with sad and confused eyes. Her eyes were red and puffy with several streaks of tears down her cheek. Izuku couldn't help but feel sad at the sight he sees. Why? My quirk is called transform, she said softly before lowering her head again. I can turn into others if I consume their BLD, she said quietly. Izuku can hear her sobs again and feels sympathy for her. She was definitely self-conscious about her quirk. If you want to borrow some BLD, I can spare you some, Izuku said with a kind smile. The girl looked up to him with eyes full of shock. Izuku couldn't help but think, cute, but knocked those thoughts away. Wait, really? She said, skeptical. Izuku nodded his head. Yeah, just when I release you don't attack me, Izuku said, keeping eye contact and reaching over to a glowing ball of light. The girl nodded her head, looking like a lost kitten and desperately wants to be released. Izuku then pinched the light and destroyed. The barrier cracked like glass, making the girl fall to the ground just in front of Izuku. Izuku quickly helped her upright and made sure she wasn't hurt. The girl had brushed it off. Izuku then raised his arm up and pulled back his sleeve, revealing his mostly purple arm. Okay, bite into here and take some BLD, I don't mind, Izuku says. The girl who looked distraught just before just lit up brightly. She grabbed Izuku's arm and grabbed it eagerly. She then opened her mouth wide and bit down on Izuku's arm hungrily. Izuku barely felt a thing thanks to his quirk. They sat in silence for a couple minutes, the girl just hungrily sucking on Izuku's BLD. Eventually she let go with a huge grin on her face, a small drip of BLD dripping down the side of her mouth. She looked at Izuku once more, except it had a lot less crazy and hunger in them than before. So what's your name, String Bin? My name is 𝗵𝗃𝗃 Toga. The girl asked, smiling like a cat. Izuku smiles before stopping himself. Would it be a good idea to tell her his name? What is she going to do? Call the police she found Izuku Yagi while being a murderer? Izuku finds it unlikely that she'll care who he is and if he is also technically a criminal. He's already told 2 people his actual name, what's one more? Izuku, he answered, not giving a last name. He wasn't a Yagi, never was. Izuku-kun. It's such a cute name, she said happily, clapping her hands. Izuku was taken aback by her enthusiasm, but he kind of enjoyed it. But then she put a finger to her chin and looked at Izuku with a thinking face. Wait, are you Izuku Yagi? Wasn't he quirkless? She asked. Izuku gulped and looked down. Yes I am, and don't tell anyone I have a quirk. I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know I had it until I ran away, Izuku says. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 nodded her head understandingly. Izuku sighed and looked back over to her. He didn't want to ruin the moment, but he had to get back on topic. So Toga, Izuku started. 𝗵𝗃𝗃. We're friends now, Izuku-kun, she smiled. Izuku blushed but put his thoughts away. So 𝗵𝗃𝗃, he said, making the teen's smile bigger. Izuku looked down as he didn't want to see it disappear. Why did you do this? Izuku asked. He didn't need to be looking at her to know her smile dropped. He felt the tension rise immediately. Izuku looked up to see 𝗵𝗃𝗃 running her finger across the ground. It's villainous. My quirk is called Transform, and if I consume another person's BLD, I turn into them. But can't help myself. I crave BLD, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said. Izuku knows he should probably comfort her, focusing on the last sentence, but his natural quirk geek mind went straight into action. He was a bit surprised she didn't have a speed quirk. She was incredibly fast, but it might be from training. Perhaps Izuku could ask for some tips. Whoa, that's so cool. Can you use the quirks of people you transform into? Is your limit for your quirk set at the same time or changes depending on how much BLD you've drunk? Izuku asked with stars in his eyes. Izuku looked taken aback, confused of what Izuku had just said. Wait, you don't think it's villainous? Even after I killed those 2 people. And, attacked you? She asked, her voice becoming quieter near the end. Izuku sighed and shook his head. What you did was villainous, but your quirk is not. You also have little control of your actions as your instinct make you crave BLD. It's just as normal as water and food for you, Izuku stated. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 looked at Izuku, astounded and touched by what he just said. She then gives a small smile. Thank you, you're the first person to have ever been like that to me, she said. Izuku smiles and rubs the back of his head. No problem, Izuku smiled. Hey, I told you my quirk, it is your turn, Izuku-kun. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, radiating happiness again. Izuku flinches before forcing himself to relax. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 won't judge him for his quirk, and it's not like she knows the story of All for One anyway. It's called All for One. It allows me to steal quirks for others and also give them away, Izuku said. Upon hearing this, Izuku jumps forward, pushing her hands onto Izuku's knees. Her face became incredibly close to Izuku's. Izuku quickly became red from embarrassment, especially at the close proximity he was with a girl. So you can give me a quirk? Himiko asked excitedly. Izuku shoots his hands up in front of his face, trying to create an unneeded defense and put some distance between the two. I see can't it's dang jealous. Besides I'm still new to the Q quirk, Izuku stuttered. Himiko pouted but nodded her head nonetheless. She moved away from Izuku, still sitting close to him but now on her knees. But Izuku had just gotten an idea from his quirk. He's not sure if it will work but it's worth a shot. Hey Himiko, can I try something? Izuku asked. Himiko instantly nodded her head. Of course Aizen, you helped me and I want to help you, Himiko said. Izuku shrugged slightly as he raised his hand towards her. This isn't really helping me, Izuku said before touching Himiko. Izuku then felt the sensation of gaining a quirk. The quirk felt dry and needy but extremely flexible. Izuku decided to dive deeper into the quirk to see what it exactly was all about. He scanned around and found it was relatively a straightforward quirk. However, Izuku did find some concerning details. Specifically the emotions attached to the quirk. The first one was the need for BLD. It was a huge aspect of the quirk, concerningly huge. No wonder she went insane, she basically needed BLD all the time. The second one was when she activated her quirk. It was a random attribute but when she alters her identity to someone else, if she knows how they act a bit, she can mimic their personality exactly. Definitely helpful for a quirk like this. But that now became a problem for Izuku. Well, he had a theory. A non-active quirk he has called emotive deprive. The quirk that used to belong to Himaki. It makes it so that she couldn't feel any emotion whatsoever, which wasn't a quirk that anyone would want. But if Izuku combined it with Himiko's quirk, it would probably negate the emotional attachments her quirk has, effectively eliminating her need for BLD. But in doing that would also destroy the bonus of being able to blend in as someone perfectly. Izuku didn't want that, so he looked deeper into the quirk and found something else interesting. There seems to be a strange limitation to Himiko's quirk. She can't use the person's quirk she has transformed into unless she has a strong emotional attachment to them. If Izuku got rid of that, she'd no longer have that limitation. Izuku weighed the pros and cons and ultimately deciding if Himiko will no longer be a villain anymore, the need to perfectly blend in is no longer necessary. So Izuku grabbed emotive deprive and forced the quirk into Himiko's transform. The quirk combined and nothing really changed, only the emotional aspects of it destroyed. Himiko watched Izuku intently as he silently played with 3 different lights in his hands. She watched as he combined 2 of those lights together before putting the light inside of her. She felt her body, trying to figure out what had happened. She then started licking her lips before noticing something. She wasn't hungry. She stared over at Izuku as he opened his eyes. Himiko dashed over to him and embraced him tightly. I'm not hungry anymore. Thank you, thank you, thank you, she said, squeezing Izuku tightly. Izuku laughed and returned her hug. When Himiko eventually let go, she frowned and pointed at Izuku's waist. Sorry, she said almost shamefully. Izuku raised an eyebrow before realizing what she meant. His clothes were now covered in BLD. Izuku internally started to freak out. What was he going to do? These were the last good clothes he had and now were covered in BLD. He couldn't buy more and it's not like he can just walk around with BLD-soaked clothes. Wait, he has Himamori. Why didn't he use it before? Wait, I've got this, Izuku said. He then started to draw some BLD. Himiko was concerned before he started forming his BLD into clothes. He gave them both new pairs. Izuku put up a wall of tentacles to give themselves privacy as they changed into their new clothes. Izuku buttoned up before turning to Himiko. So Himiko, where do you live? Izuku asked. Oh, on the street, Himiko replied casually. Izuku looked at her, concerned. He supposes it does make sense. That fact isn't really surprising, but it doesn't make it any less sad. Oh, I have a place in a junkyard. You can come with me if you want, Izuku said. Why did he say that? Izuku doesn't want to be rude, but Himiko isn't really sane and not very intelligent. It wouldn't be a smart idea to bring someone else with those qualities to his hideout where he is trying not to be found by his ex-family so they don't kill them. Really, I'd love to Izuku-kun. Himiko smiled widely. All of Izuku's doubts instantly vanished as soon as he saw her smile. Wonder why? Izuku and 𝗵𝗃𝗃 then started to walk to Izuku's home. Izuku thinks. He smiles at the thought. Home, it certainly is. What about those 2 dead bodies? Well, Izuku couldn't exactly call the police, so he'll let someone else do that. But he took the other person's quirk before leaving. What? It's not like they'll use it. Izuku and 𝗵𝗃𝗃 made it to 𝗧𝗪𝗏 beach and walked around all of the garbage until they made it to the caravan. Izuku walked up to it and was about to open the door until he felt a small tug on his shirt. Izuku turns around to see 𝗵𝗃𝗃 looking at him with a pout. Izuku-kun, you've helped me so much today in such a short period of time. Is there anything I can do to help you, please? 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, looking at Izuku pleadingly. Izuku had to look away as he felt his cheeks turn hot. He started to think if there was something she can do before an idea popped into his head. Actually, you can. I noticed you were really good at fighting. Could you teach me? Izuku asks. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 smiles widely. Of course, she yelled happily. Izuku smiled as well, feeling incredibly happy. It was strange. Izuku was always wishing he had a cool quirk like his friends or sister his entire life, but now, in a moment like this, Izuku is kind of glad he never found out he had all for one. It felt right. Doc, Aizawa and 𝗬𝗍𝗧 all sat in Doc's office. Doc had sent the person who she gave the powerful painkillers to. He had agreed to come and now they were just waiting. Doc was apprehensive because she knew the man. She had told the other 2 he had a horrible past and is prone to violent outbursts if something triggers memories from his past. Also, the fact that he despises heroes with a burning passion made her concerned that Aizawa should leave, but he insisted on staying along with 𝗬𝗍𝗧. Heavy knocks radiate from the door. Doc instantly stands up and walks towards it. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 and Aizawa stay where they are and watch her as they open the door. When it opens, they don't see anyone, but it was because there were 3 steps to the door. The man was currently at the bottom. A deep and raspy voice then spoke. Hey Doc, you need something? The man asked, his tone seemed tired. Doc nodded and looked back at Aizawa. He didn't waver and held her worried gaze. She sighed and looked down again. 𝗬𝗏, you've heard that a boy named Izuku Yagi went missing, she said. What about it? 𝗬𝗏 says in a dry voice. Well, it was found that he had powerful painkillers in his room. You're the only person that I give those to, so a hero and a detective want to know. Doc didn't get to finish her sentence as heavy footsteps slammed up the steps. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 flinched while Aizawa didn't waver. A hand pushed Doc out of a way and a man walked into the room. He had shaggy black hair that was too dark to be natural. He had icy turquoise eyes and wearing a lot of black clothing. A large biker's jacket with a plain white shirt underneath it. Generic black pants and combat boots. But that wasn't what caught the detective and Aizawa's eye. He had several patches of burned purple skin that was connected to his healthy skin by staples. He glared at the 2 with hatred and intensity. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 had to admit he was slightly scared. If it wasn't for Aizawa next to him and knowing this guy didn't have a mutant quirk from his appearance, he perhaps would have pissed himself. But unexpectedly, his heated gaze stopped and the man sighed. He then put his hands in his jacket's pockets. Ugh, I thought it was someone else, 𝗬𝗏 said before walking to a wall and leaning up against it, no longer as hostile as he was before. Oh, are you fine with Eraserhead, 𝗬𝗏? Doc said. 𝗬𝗏 scoffs and rolls his eyes. I don't have a problem with Eraserhead. I presumed All Might would have been here, 𝗬𝗏 said. Doc looked at 𝗬𝗏 confused while 𝗬𝗍𝗧 and Aizawa's eyes widen. 𝗬𝗏 looks over them and smirks at their reaction. What's wrong? That's why I'm here, isn't it? Izuku Yagi, 𝗬𝗏 says, smirking at the 2. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 narrows his eyes. How do you know dash? 𝗬𝗍𝗧 says, but 𝗬𝗏 was interrupted. And what makes you think I'll tell you? 𝗬𝗏 snarks. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 flinches back at the man's sudden mood change. Aizawa glares at 𝗬𝗏 and puts his hand on his capture weapon. 𝗬𝗏, did you or did you not give Izuku Yagi your painkillers? Aizawa asks threateningly. 𝗬𝗏's mood instantly changes again as he smirks and shrugs his shoulders. Yes, 𝗬𝗏 answers. This shocks Aizawa as he didn't expect an honest answer. 𝗬𝗍𝗧 then elbows Aizawa and looks at him sternly. 𝗬𝗍𝗧's quirk doesn't work if he wasn't the one to ask the question. Doc then walks over to 𝗬𝗏 and frowns at him. Wait, 𝗬𝗵𝗃, why the hell would you do that? I know you and you aren't that type of person, Doc said with crossed arms. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 chuckles and looks over to her, giving one last glance to the detective and hero. Do you remember the scrawny bush-head kid I brought in 2 years ago? 𝗬𝗵𝗃 asks. Doc's eyes widened. Wait, was that Izuku Yagi? Doc asked, covering her mouth with her hand. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 smirked and nodded his head. Hold on, what was this about Izuku? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked, gaining the two's attention. Doc nods her head and readjusts her glasses. Well, 2 years ago, 𝗬𝗵𝗃 brought a kid in who was basically on death's door. He was bleeding profusely and had severe burns and freezer burns. Not only that, he had 2 fractured ribs and 2 ribs that were indented, which means they have been broken before and healed incorrectly, Doc said. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 cringed at the mental image it gave him while Izuku scowled. If 𝗬𝗵𝗃 didn't bring him here, he would have died. But when he woke up, he booked it out of here claiming he'd be late for school. I just didn't have the tools to track him down, Doc said. Wait, then how did he end up with those painkillers, 𝗬𝗵𝗃? Izuku asked. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 gave him a deadpan look. The same way I knew his name was Izuku 𝗳𝗏𝗂𝗧𝗏. I know who he is and he kind of knows who I am, 𝗬𝗵𝗃 said. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looks between the two as they glare at each other. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 looks over to Doc, who raises her hands up with confusion. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 sighs and stands up. Alright, 𝗬𝗵𝗃, it is clear you need to come to the station with me and Eraserhead. It is clear that you have information that you shouldn't and that your name isn't 𝗬𝗵𝗃. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, trying to fake confidence because low-key, he was scared of this man. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 scoffs at the mention of his name being fake. Plus, how about this detective? 𝗬𝗵𝗃 starts, looking at 𝗧𝗵𝗲 threateningly, making him gulp. You give me 2 weeks, then I'll willing walk down to the station and answer all of your questions, 𝗬𝗵𝗃 says. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was about to decline when Izuku spoke. Sure, he said in a tired voice. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 choked on air and turned to him. He was looking at 𝗬𝗵𝗃 with a neutral expression while he was smirking. What? No, I didn't agree, he states. In the end, he didn't have a choice.